Sean McCann.
Greetings. Welcome to Occult Kubrick. Seems that people liked the last episode, and that's fortunate because all I was doing was reading a book, but it is tangentially related to Kubrick research and Eyes Wide Shut. Those that care about Eyes Wide Shut should indeed care about this book. And I hope that all of you have enjoyed that I have brought it to your attention and to your ears and eyes. Today we will be continuing with page 156, Hitler and the Holy Lance. The Holy Lance, which pierced Christ's side at his crucifixion, became a talisman for the Teutonic warlords of Europe. In the 20th century, it was plundered by Adolf Hitler, who knew its mystical significance all too well. The would-be conqueror of the world linked his destiny with the lance. In the streets of Vienna in 1913, a down-and-out former art student vainly tried to make a living by selling postcard-sized watercolors. Occasionally driven off the streets by the cold, he would wander through the corridors of the Hofburg Museum. Here, he was particularly fascinated by a number of valuable pieces known as the Habsburg Regalia. And among these, the unprepossessing young vagrant, Adolf Hitler, paid special attention to the Holy Lance, reputed to be the spear that pierced Christ's side when he had given up the ghost on the cross. The legend of the Holy Lance takes its origin from John 19:33 through 37. But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was dead already, they brake not his legs. But one of the soldiers with a spear pierced his side, and forthwith came there out blood and water. And he that saw it bare record, and his record is true, and he knoweth that he saith true, that ye might believe. For these things were done that the scripture should be fulfilled. A bone of him shall not be broken. And again, another scripture saith, they shall look on him whom they pierced. The verse following this tells how Joseph of Arimathea gained permission to take the body of Jesus and, helped by Nicodemus, laid it in a tomb on the night of Good Friday. Other oral and written traditions, beginning with the earliest Christians and continuing to the Middle Ages, depict the rich Jewish philanthropist as obsessed with the artifacts associated with the dead Christ. He's said to have preserved the cross itself, the nails, the crown of thorns, and the shroud from which Christ rose on the third day. Through clues left by Joseph, Helena, mother of the first Christian emperor, Constantine, was able to rediscover these relics. But even before Christ's death, according to the same traditions, Joseph had begun collecting. After the Last Supper, he took charge of the cup in which Jesus had consecrated the bread and wine. After the resurrection, Joseph kept the cup alongside the spear of John's Gospel, the Holy Grail, and the Holy Lance. So right there, that's male and female. That's the Yoni and the Shiva. Okay. That's the blade and the chalice. Joseph's subsequent travels with the Grail and the Lance are the subject of folk tales and legends in almost every country in Europe. In Britain, he is said to have hidden the Grail at Glastonbury. Afterwards, he thrust his staff into the ground, where it sprouted to become the still surviving Glastonbury thorn, which blooms only at Christmas. Romantic writers, beginning with the French poet Chrétien de Troyes, in about 1180, bound up the fate of the Holy Grail and the Holy Lance with the adventures of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, notably with Lancelot, Gawain, and Percival. Alongside these stories themselves, based on Celtic traditions and scraps of historical fact, there ran a thin thread of evidence that the lance, at least, had survived the centuries, passed down sometimes through good hands, sometimes through unworthy ones. With its ownership came power, to be used for great good or for terrible evil. At least 4 holy lances existed in Europe during the early part of the present century. Perhaps, the 20th century. Perhaps the best known was in the keeping of the Vatican, although the Roman Catholic Church seems to have regarded it as no more than a curio. Certainly, no preternatural powers were claimed for it by the papal authorities. A second lance was kept in Paris, where it had been taken by Saint Louis in the 13th century after his return from the Crusades in Palestine. Another lance, preserved in Krakow, Poland, was merely a copy of the Habsburg lance. The latter probably had the best pedigree of them all. It had been discovered at Antioch in 1098 during the First Crusade, but mystery and possibly imagination obscured the manner of its finding. Crusaders had mounted a successful siege of the city and had taken control where a mere heavily armed band of Saracens rode up and turned the tables, shutting up the Crusaders within the walls in their turn. After 3 weeks, water and food were running low, and surrender seemed the only course. Then a priest claimed to have had a miraculous vision of the Holy Lance buried in the church of St. Peter. When excavations at the spot revealed the iron spearhead, the Crusaders were filled with a new zeal and rode out to rout their attackers. Germanic tradition, somewhat at odds with these dates, claimed the Habsburg lance had in fact been carried as a talisman in the 9th century by Charlemagne through 47 victorious campaigns. It had also endowed him with clairvoyant powers. Only when he accidentally dropped it did Charlemagne die. The lance later passed into the possession of Heinrich the Fowler, who founded Royal House of the Saxons and drove the Poles eastward, a foreshadowing. Hitler may have thought in years later of his own destiny. After passing through the hands of 5 Saxon monarchs, it fell into the possession of the succeeding Hohenstaufens of Swabia. Swabia. You should all know that from Klaus Schwab. Look into that. That's all connected there too. One of the most outstanding of this line was Frederick Barbarossa, born in 1123. Before his death, 67 years later, Barbarossa had conquered Italy and driven the Pope himself into exile. Again, Hitler may well have admired the brutal harshness coupled with charismatic personality that drove Barbarossa to success. Like Charlemagne, however, Barbarossa made the mistake of dropping the lance as he waded a stream in Sicily. He died within minutes of the event. The fascination of the spear. This was the legend of the weapon, now among the Habsburg regalia, which so fascinated the young Hitler, he spent his first visit to the lance studying its every detail. It was just over a foot, 30 centimeters long, tapering to a slender, leaf-shaped point, and at some time the blade had been grooved into admit a nail, allegedly one of those used in the crucifixion. This had been bound in place with gold wire. The spear had been broken, but the two halves were joined by a sheath of silver, while two gold crosses had been inlaid into the base near the haft. The evidence of Hitler's personal fascination with the Habsburg lance rests on the testimony of Dr. Walter Johannes Stein, a mathematician, economist, and occultist who claimed to have met the future Führer just before First World War. Stein, a native of Vienna, was born in 1891, the son of a rich barrister. He was to be a polymath and an intellectual adventurer until his death in 1957. He took a first degree in science and a doctorate in psychophysical research at the University of Vienna. He became expert in archaeology, early Byzantine art, and medieval history in the First World War. As an officer in the Austrian army, he was decorated for gallantry. In 1928, he published an eccentric pamphlet, World History in the Light of the Holy Grail, which was circulated in Germany, Holland, and Britain. Just 5 years after the Reichsstuffer Heinrich Himmler ordered that he be pressed into service with the Nazi Occult Bureau, but Stein escaped to Britain. The Second World War found him in the guise of a British intelligence agent. After helping to obtain the plans for Operation Celian, Hitler's projected invasion of Britain, he acted as advisor to Winston Churchill on the German leader's occult involvements. Stein never published his own memoirs, but before his death, he befriended an ex-Sandhurst commando officer, then a journalist, Trevor Ravenscroft. Using Stein's notes and conversations, Ravenscroft published a book, Spear of Destiny, in 1972, which first brought Hitler's fascination with the Habsburg spear to public attention. What hold could the Holy Lance, a Christian symbol, have on the violently anti-Christian ex-Roman Catholic Adolf Hitler? Already he was given to violent anti-Semitic rantings, and already he was a devout student of Friedrich Nietzsche's Antichrist, with its condemnation of Christianity and the ultimate Jewish consequence. Part of the answer lay in a medieval occult tradition regarding the history of the Holy Lance. As the Gospel of John describes, the Roman soldier who pierced Christ and unwittingly fulfilled the Old Testament prophecies that Christ's bones would not be broken. Had he not done this, had he not done as he did, the destiny of mankind would have been different. According to both Matthew and Mark, the true nature of Christ was revealed to the soldier, said to be named Gaius Cassius Longinus at the moment. And when the centurion which stood over against him saw that he so cried out and gave up the ghost, he said, "Truly this man was the Son of God." Mark 15:39. To the mind of the occultist, an instrument used for such momentous purpose would itself become the focus of magical power. And as Richard Cavendish succinctly put it, speaking of the Grail and the lance in his book, King Arthur and the Grail, "A thing is not sacred because it is good. It is sacred because it contains mysterious and awesome power. It is as potent for good or evil as a huge charge of electricity. If it is tampered with, however compelling and understandable the motive, the consequences may be catastrophic for entirely innocent people." According to Stein, Hitler was fully aware of this concept as early as 1912. Indeed, it was through Hitler's obsession with the legend of the lance and its power as a magical wand that the two men met. In the summer of 1912, Dr. Stein purchased an edition of Parsifal, a Grail romance by the 13th century German poet Wolfram von Eisenbach, from an occult bookseller in Vienna. It was full of scribbled marginal commentaries displaying a combination of occult learning and pathological racism. On the flyleaf, its previous owner had signed his name, Adolf Hitler. Through the bookseller, Stein traced Hitler and spent many hours with him, appalled but fascinated. Although it was to be years before the poverty-stricken postcard painter took his first steps on the road to power, there was already an evil charisma about the man. Through all the torturous windings of his discourse, one obsession stood out clearly. He had a mystic destiny to fulfill, and according to Stein, the lance held the key. Hitler described to Stein how the spear had acquired a special significance for him. "I slowly became aware of a mighty presence around it, the same awesome presence which I had experienced inwardly on those rare occasions in my life when I had sensed that a great destiny awaited me. A window in the future was opened up to me, through which I saw, in a single flash of illumination, a future event by which I knew beyond contradiction that the blood in my veins would one day become the vessel of the folk spirit of my people." Hitler never revealed the nature of his vision, but Stein believed that he had seen himself a quarter of a century later in the Heldenplatz outside the Hofburg Museum, addressing Austrian Nazis and ordinary bewildered Viennese. There, on 14 March 1938, the German Führer was to announce his annexation of Austria into the German Reich, and to give the order to carry the Habsburg regalia off to Nuremberg, spiritual home of the Nazi movement. A curious priority. Taking possession of the treasure was a curious priority in view of the fact that Hitler despised the House of Habsburg as traitors to the Germanic race. Nevertheless, on 13 October, the spear and the other items of the regalia were loaded onto an armored train with an SS guard and taken across the German border. They were lodged in the hall of St. Catherine's Church, where Hitler proposed to set up a Nazi war museum. Stein believed that when Hitler had the lance in his possession, his latent ambitions for world conquest began to grow and flourish. If Hitler's knowledge of the Habsburg spear history was as extensive as Stein claimed, he must have been aware of the legends concerning the fate of Charlemagne, Barbarossa, and others who had wielded it as a weapon, only to perish when it fell from their grasp. The legends seem to be confirmed by a chilling coincidence that marked the end of the connection with the lance. After heavy Allied bombing in October 1944, during which Nuremberg suffered extensive damage, Hitler ordered the spear, along with the rest of the Habsburg regalia, to be buried in a specially constructed vault. 6 months later, the American 7th Army had surrounded the ancient city, which was defended by 22,000 SS troops, 100 panzers, and 22 regiments of artillery. For 4 days, the veteran American Thunderbird Division battered at this formidable defense until on 20th of April, 1945, Hitler's 56th birthday, the victorious Stars and Stripes was hoisted over the rubble. During the next few days, while American troops rounded up Nazi survivors and began the long process of interrogating them, Company C of the U.S. Army's 3rd Military Government Regiment, under their commander, Lieutenant William Horn, were detailed to search for the Habsburg treasure. By chance, a shell that made their task easier by blowing away brickwork and revealing the entrance to the vault. After some difficulty with the vault's steel doors, Lieutenant Horn entered the underground chamber and peered through the dusty gloom. There, lying on a bed of faded red velvet, was the fabled Spear of Longinus. Lieutenant Horn reached out and took possession of the spear on behalf of the United States government. It was the afternoon of 30 April 1945 that much is recorded history. And however skeptical may be the critics about Walter Stein, the occult in general, and the Holy Lance legends in particular, it is also historical fact that a few hundred miles away in a bunker in Berlin, Adolf Hitler chose that evening on which to take a pistol and shoot himself. If you can believe that. Legions of Hell. The Nazi Party's rise to power has been attributed to occult practice, and Adolf Hitler himself was undoubtedly fascinated by the black arts. How and why did this bizarre association develop? In the late summer of 1940, as the Battle of Britain was drawing to a close, Toby O'Brien, then press secretary to Winston Churchill, had an inspiration. He was sitting in his bath one morning when the words of a coarse comic song began to form unbidden in his mind. He repeated the composition over lunch later that day to a group of high-ranking British officers in Whitehall. They were convulsed with mirth. Some of them wrote it down while others memorized it. Within weeks, it had filtered through the ranks, and it was on the lips of squadron leaders and squaddies, admirals and artificers, sung to the tune of Colonel Bogey. It went, Hitler, he only had one ball. Goring had two, but very small. Himmler was very similar, but poor old Goebbels had no balls at all. Toby O'Brien certainly did not believe his composition was accurate. Precious little was known about the sexual endowments or behaviors of the Fuhrer, but when Russian military surgeons examined Hitler's charred remains in the Berlin bunker in May 1945, they discovered that Hitler was indeed monorchid. He possessed but one testicle. It was a bizarre and extreme coincidence. But Hitler's defect may have had profound significance for the development of his occult ideas. According to Dr. Walter Stein, whose observations on the personal conversations with Hitler in Vienna formed the basis of Trevor Ravencroft's The Spear of Destiny, Hitler had, as early as 1912, formed a passion for the music of Richard Wagner, particularly for Parsifal, which praised Teutonic knighthood and exalted the Aryan race. Soon Hitler discovered Wagner's source, the medieval poetry of Wolfram von Eisenbach. In fact, it was through buying a copy of Eisenbach's Parsifal that had once belonged to Hitler that Dr. Stein met him. Dr. Stein was impressed by the meticulousness of the marginal notes though simultaneously appalled by the pathological race hatred that they showed. Among them appeared numerous references to the character Klingsor, whom Hitler apparently identified with the notorious 9th century tyrant Landolf II of Capua. Landolf's avaricious grasping for power had led him to study the black arts, and it was for these practices that he was excommunicated in AD 875. But one other fact must have given Hitler a sense of identity with the 9th century Führer. Landolf seemed to have been either partly or totally castrated. Eisenbach described him as the man who was smooth between his legs. We know that Hitler was easily influenced as a youth, avidly soaking up the ideas of what the heck? Excuse me, guys, here, I lost it. Soaking up the ideas of those Wagner and Nietzsche, for example, who impressed him. Landolf's power mania and his unfortunate anatomical similarity to himself must have struck the young Adolf. And there is reason to suspect that Landolf's black magic did so too. Another source gives us a very clear indication that Hitler was impressed by magical symbolism from the beginning of his political career. Just a side note, people should look at one of Wake the Dead's previous episodes titled Ancient Transgender Cults. It describes the cult of Inanna and the Gali, who were priests of Inanna, who would remove their penis and testicles completely. They would be totally smooth. They were called nullos. They were called Gali. And they would do dances. I mean, they would dress as women and they would sell their bodies as women. They would be priestesses of Inanna, but they were male, but they fixed that by changing their gender, altering their, all that. So that I spoke about that in regards to the current transgender stuff and how that relates to the uh it's the same old ancient female cult of the mother goddess that we talked about in the first episode. So anyway, yeah, there's the speculation there with the one nut being similar to a nullo. I don't know if I agree. I don't know if that doesn't really track, but it's fine. We're reading this. We're not going to have our comments. I'm going to keep our comments to a minimum. Sorry, guys. Throughout the latter half of the 19th century, German pseudo-intellectual circles had been obsessed with the movement compounded of pagan ritual and notions of Nordic purity, invented by a man named Guido von List. Born in 1848, the son of a rich trader in leather goods and top boots, pointers, perhaps, to things to come, von List had renounced his Catholicism when he was 14 with a solemn oath that he would one day build a temple to Woden, also called Odin, war god of Scandinavian mythology. By the 1870s, von List had a sizable group of followers dedicated to observing pagan feasts at the solstices and equinoxes. In 1875, they attracted attention to themselves by worshiping the sun as Baldur, the Nordic god slain in battle who rose from the dead. The rite was held on a hilltop near Vienna and concluded with von List burying 8 wine bottles carefully laid out in the shape of a swastika. The swastika had been a widespread symbol of good fortune from earliest times and among all nations. It had been found on Chinese, Mongolian, and American Indian artifacts, was used by the ancient Greeks as a pottery decoration, and by medieval architects as a border design for stained glass windows. Its name in Middle English, Filfot, is said to mean fill foot, since it was a device used for filling the foot of windows. Swastika stems from the Sanskrit su asti, which means literally translated, good he is. In fact, the swastika, with its arms trailing as if the whole pattern were spinning clockwise, symbolized the sun, the powers of light. In 1920s, when the National Socialist movement was in its infancy, Hitler asked for designs to be submitted for the early recognizable symbol, or for an easily recognizable symbol, akin to the hammer and sickle of the Russian communists. Frederick, yeah, there's a lot of stuff there's a lot of pictures here, guys, and there's a lot of stuff on the margins. We got, a world of ice, cosmological theories. Blacksmith turned engineer, became a mainstay of the Nazi worldview. All right, we're not going into that. Anyway, okay. Friedrich Krohn, a Steinberg dentist, who was also an occultist, suggested a swastika on a white disc with a red background. Red for blood and the social ideal, white for nationalism and purity of race, and the swastika for the struggle of the victory of the Aryan man. Hitler was delighted, but for one detail. The traditional right-handed swastika was to be reversed to form what the writer Francis King terms an evocation of evil, spiritual devolution, and black magic. Dr. Krohn fully realized Hitler's intention in changing the ancient sign, for he was a member of the German order, which, with the Thule Society, had taken over where von Liszt's rather amateurish organization had left off in the years before the First World War. Both societies, which eventually became almost interchangeable in ideas and even membership, were originally composed of the German officer class and professions who were convinced of a massive international Jewish conspiracy backed up by occult practices. To counter this, they established their own Nordic occult-based Freemasonry, complete with elaborate rituals and robes, Viking helmets and swords. More importantly, the Thule Society, which took its name from the fabled land of Ultima Thule, a sort of paradise on earth, began to recruit new members from the lower classes and disseminated anti-Semitic material in its various newspapers, one of which, the Volkischer Beobachter, I just can't pronounce it, eventually became the official journal of the Nazi Party. There is no doubt that Hitler, both in his down-and-out days in Vienna and later as leader of the rising Nazi Party in the 1920s and 1930s, was constantly fascinated by fringe occult theories. One of these was the lunatic world ice theory, a complicated set of ideas propagated by the Austrian engineer named Hans Horbiger, 1860 to 1931. He claimed that the planets had been created by the collision of stars such as the sun with huge chunks of ice. Norbiger claimed that his system enabled him to forecast the weather accurately. Some occult writers, notably Pauwels and Bergier in the Dawn of Magic, have suggested that Horbiger's forecasts influenced Hitler's disastrous Russian campaign. Latterly, Hitler became obsessed with map dowsing, swinging a pendulum over a map to find hidden objects. The topic was brought to the attention of Hitler aides by an architect named Ludwig Straniak, yet another amateur occultist. Straniak demonstrated to German naval officers his apparent ability to pinpoint the whereabouts of their ships at sea simply by dangling a pendulum over an admiralty chart. They were particularly impressed when he located the pocket battleship Prinz Eugen, at the time on a secret mission. The Black Magicians. Hitler's involvement with astrology and predictions in general had been much debated. It has even been claimed that he had powers of precognition, which allowed him to foresee the lack of opposition to his invasions of Austria and Czechoslovakia. But Hitler's real talent was a masterly judge of the European political mood. And even this intuition deserted him when he decided to invade Poland in 1939. Joseph Goebbels, propaganda minister, used astrology cleverly but cynically, quoting Nostradamus, for example, in support of Nazi domination. Hitler, and in particular SS Chief Himmler, took astrology seriously. In view of this varied preoccupation with the occult, many have suggested that among high-ranking Nazis Hitler and Himmler, at least, were in the real sense black magicians. However, one great question confronts those who claim this. Why, when the Nazis rose to power, were occult writings and practices so rigorously stamped upon? For so they were. In 1934, the first move was made when the Berlin police issued a ban on all forms of fortune telling, from fairground palmists to society astrologers. That the order came from the central headquarters is certain, for the police officers who carried out the orders were extremely confused as to the intention behind them. They both impounded innocent books and let go books of magic spells and similar works. Next came a general suppression of all occult groups, even to the chagrin and surprise of members, the German Order and the Thule Society. Both these contained many Nazis, of course, but even of these there were no exception. For instance, Georg Lanz von Liebenfels, whose writings inspired much of the German racial mystique and whom boasted that by introducing Hitler to occult groups, he had been his guru, was told that he must not publish occult works in future. With the sole exceptions of the inner party members, such as certain of Himmler's personal SS aides, occultists of all shades had been done away with or driven underground. In German-occupied countries by 1940, the answer to the enigma has been pointed out by such writers as Francis King and J.H. Brennan. They argue that in regimes that in some ways are analogous with Hitler's, Mao's China, for instance, and Stalin's Russia, there was no such systematic weeding out of occultists. True, Stalin pounced on Freemasons, Kabbalists, and the like, but only because they were secret societies per se, not because of their magical activities. In China, even after the Cultural Revolution, seers and astrologers were frowned upon as superstitious, but nothing desperate was done against them. They were more mocked at than persecuted. Authoritarian regimes do not seem to fear magical practices as such, but Nazi Germany had to tamp down freelance occultists because it was, in effect, trampling down its own rivals, in much the same way that Trotskyites suffered under Stalin. There was only one occult movement permissible under the Third Reich, and it was hidden deep in its coils. It was led by the supreme magus Adolf Hitler and his acolyte Heinrich Himmler, both of them powerful black magicians. Was Hitler a black magician? This is interesting because we know that Kubrick did not create the Aryan Papers, and we know that Kubrick had this book. So that movie, I wish we could have that movie because he would tell us so much. Anyway, getting back to this. Right. Was Hitler a black magician? Adolf Hitler had an extraordinary ability to influence others, but was his charisma due to sheer strength of personality, to hypnotic skills, or to diabolical magic? Could he literally bewitch people? The goal of every magician is power over natural forces. He aims to seize the infinite forces of the cosmos and wield them like a sword in his own service. A magician who seeks this power for his own ends without the wish to serve any higher good is a black magician. According to most magical schools of thought, he pays a high price in the end for his pride. Often he becomes possessed by the spirits he calls upon and is destroyed by them. In the view of several occultists, Adolf Hitler was a powerful black magician. According to one of Hitler's few friends, from his early years in Linz, his personal power had developed by the time he was 15 years old, and very startling it was. On one occasion, Adolf Hitler stood in front of me and gripped my hands and held them tight. The words did not come smoothly from his mouth as they usually did, but rather erupted, hoarse and raucous. It was as if another being spoke out of his body and moved him as much as it moved me. It was not at all a case of a speaker carried away by his own words. On the contrary, I rather felt as though he himself listened with astonishment and emotion to what burst forth from him with elemental force. The writer of this excerpt was Occult Kubrick. He was describing a midnight walk in 1904 with the 15-year-old Hitler following a performance of Wagner's opera Rheinsee, which tells the story of the meteoric rise and fall of a Roman tribune. Hitler's inspired speech concerned the future of Germany and a mandate which one day he would receive from the people to lead them from servitude. According to Kubrick, Hitler spent a great deal of time studying Oriental mysticism, astrology, hypnotism, Germanic mythology, and other aspects of occultism. By 1909, he had made contact with Dr. Jorg Lanz von Liebenfels, a former Cistercian monk who 2 years previously had opened a temple to the Order of New Templars at the Thumbledown Werfenstein Castle on the banks of the Danube. Von Liebenfels had assumed his aristocratic-sounding name. He was born plain Adolf Lance and came of solid bourgeois stock. His following was small but wealthy. A disciple of Guido von List, see page 161, he flew a swastika flag from his battlements, performed ritual magic, and ran a magazine entitled Ostara, a propaganda journal of occultism and race mysticism to which the young Hitler became an avid subscriber. In 1932, von Liebenfels wrote to a colleague, "Hitler is one of our pupils. You will one day experience that he, and through him we, will one day be victorious and develop a movement that will make the world tremble." One of this ex-monk's pronouncements was that human breeding farms should be set up in order to eradicate Slavic and Alpine elements from Germanic hereditary, prefiguring Himmler's idea of an SS stud farm by over 20 years. By the onset of the First World War, Hitler seems to have developed an unshakable conviction of his own high destiny As a messenger at the front, he took enormous risks as if he knew that fate would not allow him to die just yet. By the time the war ended, he had developed that curious impersonal power over those around him that was to stand him in such good stead until late in his career. Again and again, the idea that Hitler was possessed was echoed in the writings of those who knew him. His uncanny hold over individuals was a bugbear to those in the highest echelons of the state. Once, for example, Dr. Hjalmar Schacht, Hitler's financial wizard, asked Hermann Göring to speak to Hitler about a minor point of economic policy. But in Hitler's presence, Göring found himself unable to raise the matter. He told Schacht, "I often make up my mind to say something to him, but when I meet him face to face, my heart sinks." Grand Admiral Karl Donitz was so conscious of the Führer's influence that he avoided his company so as to leave his own judgment unimpaired. I purposely went very seldom to his headquarters, for I had the feeling that I would best preserve my power of initiative, and also because after several days at headquarters, I always had the feeling that I had to disengage myself from his powers of suggestion. I was doubtless more fortunate than his staff, who were constantly exposed to his power and personality. In his diary for 7 April 1943, Joseph Goebbels recorded a remarkable instance of Hitler's use of the force of his personality. The Italian dictator Mussolini had visited Germany in a state of deep depression and mental exhaustion. But putting every ounce of nervous energy into the effort, he, Hitler, succeeded in pushing Mussolini back into the rails. In those 4 days, the Duce underwent a complete change. When he got out of the train on his arrival, the Führer thought he looked like a broken old man. When he left again, he was in high fettle, ready for anything. In March 1936, Hitler made a statement that precisely summed up the impressions of those who knew him best. "I am going the way Providence dictates," he said, with the assurance of a sleepwalker. It was as if something else, not his own mind and soul, was in charge of his every action. This ruling spirit, if such it was not always kind to its host. Hitler's frantic, screaming rages, when he would literally froth at the mouth and fall to the floor, are well documented. Even more frightening is the account given by his confidant Hermann Rauschning in his book Hitler Speaks. He wakes up in the night screaming and in convulsions. He calls for help and appears to be half paralyzed. He is seized with panic that makes him tremble until the bed shakes. He utters confused and unintelligible sounds, gasping as if on the point of suffocation. Now, I just want to take an aside here to mention the recent episode I did with Jerry Marzinski on Wake the Dead. He speaks often about how crystal meth is a direct line to demons. it's the shadow people, and when you can see their eyes, it's too late or something. Like, it's really bad. People should people should understand that Hitler was uh a tweaker. He was high on crystal meth. It was like a special concoction, and his doctor had to inject him constantly. So when Hitler wakes up screaming in the night with convulsions, I mean, okay, like, he's a meth head, right? But maybe that meth head is demonically possessed. He says help, and he's paralyzed, dude. So maybe it's the drug, maybe it's the demon, maybe it's both. Who knows? Okay, right. We'll get back to it here. Hitler was not certain at all times of his guiding spirit's intentions. He suffered from a horror of ill omens. Albert Speer, who became Hitler's personal architect and finally Hitler's Minister of War Production, recounted an incident in October 1933 that shook Hitler's confidence more than anything up to that point had been able to do. He was laying the foundation stone of the House of German Art in Munich, which had been designed by his friend Paul Ludwig Troost, and which Hitler felt embodied the highest ideals of Teutonic architecture. As he tapped the stone with a silver hammer, the instrument shattered into fragments in his hand. For almost 3 months, Hitler was wrapped in morbid gloom. Then, on 21 January 1934, Troost died. Hitler's relief was immediate. He told Speer, "When that hammer shattered, I knew at once it was an evil omen. Something is going to happen, I thought. Now we know why the hammer broke. The architect was destined to die." Or so he interpreted. And so he interpreted that. Sorcerer's Apprentice. Joseph Goebbels pretended to an interest in the occult and in astrology in order to please the Fuhrer, even going so far as to gain proficiency in drawing up a horoscope. Rudolf Hess may have dabbled in occult matters, but there was only one true sorcerer's apprentice in Hitler's inner circle. Heinrich Himmler was born of middle-class parents in Munich in 1900, a weak, pale, and characterless youth whose defective eyesight compelled him to wear thick-lensed spectacles. Himmler became a fervent Nazi in the early 1920s and was appointed secretary to the Nazi Party propaganda office in Lower Bavaria. There, in his little office, he sat and talked to a portrait of Hitler on the wall. Long before he met the man himself, although he had indubitable organizing ability, Himmler's appearance made him something of a laughingstock, and it was almost jocularly that Hitler appointed him deputy Reichsfuhrer of the SS, the Schutzstaffel, or protective force, a body of about 300 men dedicated to bodyguard duties. But by 1933, Himmler had built up the SS to such a strength that he was confident enough to purge it, retaining only men of the finest Germanic physical characteristics and insisting that its officers should be able to show a non-Jewish ancestry back to 1750. After a lengthy quasi-mystical novitiate, recruits were given a ceremonial dagger and permission to wear the full black uniform of the SS, complete with silver death's head. Thereafter, they were obliged to attend what Francis King, author of Saturn and the Swastika, describes as neo-pagan ceremonies of a specifically SS religion, devised by Himmler and clearly derived from his interest in occultism and the worship of Woden. Himmler had abandoned his Catholic faith for spiritualism, astrology, and mesmerism in his late teens. He was convinced that he was a reincarnation of Heinrich the Fowler, founder of the Saxon royal house, who died in 936. All these elements were incorporated into his SS religion. Himmler devised new festivals to take the place of such Christian events as Christmas and Easter. He wrote out baptism and marriage ceremonies, though he believed polygamy would best serve the interests of the SS elite, and he even issued instructions on the correct manner of committing suicide. The center of the SS cult became the castle of Wewelsburg in Westphalia, which Himmler bought as a ruin in 1934 and rebuilt over the next 11 years at the cost of 13 million marks. The central banqueting hall contained a vast round table with 13 throne-like seats to accommodate Himmler and 12 of his closest apostles, making, as some occult writers have pointed out, a coven of 13. Beneath this hall was a hall of the dead, where plinths stood around a stone table. As each member of the inner circle of the SS died, his coat of arms would be burned and, together with his ashes, placed in an urn on one of these plinths for veneration. In this highly ludicrous atmosphere of theatricality, Himmler instigated the systematic genocide carried out by the Third Reich in its last years. Millions of Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, and others who did not conform to the ideas of the Führer and of himself were slaughtered. Many of the atrocities were prompted by Himmler's bizarre theories. For example, his belief in the power of animal heat led to the experiments in which victims were exposed in freezing water and then revived, if they were fortunate, by being placed between naked bodies of prostitutes. On another occasion, he decided the statistics would be collected of the measurements of Jewish skulls, but only the skulls of the newly dead would be suitable, so hundreds of people were decapitated. Less horrific, but equally insane, were SS researches into the Rosicrucian movement. The symbol of the suppression of the Irish harp in Ulster, the occult significance of Gothic towers, and the Eton top hat, and the magical powers of the bells of Oxford, which Himmler decided had put a charm on the Luftwaffe, preventing it inflicting serious damage on the city. The occult writer J.H. Brennan has gone so far as to suggest that Himmler was a non-person, a zombie, without mind or soul of its own, drawing upon power from Hitler like a psychic leech. Francis King has pointed out that the huge Nuremberg rallies, presided over by Hitler at his most possessed, fulfill the conditions necessary for what some witch cults describe as a cone of power. Searchlights pierced the night sky in a conical pattern above vast crowds, which generated a giant surge of emotion centered on the strutting figure of Hitler. But if Himmler could be magically influenced for evil, he could also be influenced for good in the same way. The unlikely instrument of this good was a plump blonde masseur and occultist named Felix Kirstein. He had been trained in osteopathy and allied skills by a mysterious Chinese doctor named Ko. Dr. Ko was also an occultist and mystic who apparently developed latent psychic powers in Kirsten. Success and fame came to Kirsten, and he was ordered to attend Himmler, who suffered from chronic stomach cramps in 1938. Thereafter, the SS chief was almost totally dependent on Kirsten, who was able on a number of occasions to save hundreds of Jewish lives by his hold on Himmler's mind. A post-war investigating commission concluded that Kirsten's service to mankind and to the cause of peace was so outstanding that no comparable precedent could be found for it in history. Awesome power. By what appears to have been sheer force of will, for instance, Kirsten persuaded Himmler on more than one occasion to defer the extermination of concentration camp prisoners. Kirsten would worry away like a terrier until Himmler dropped the whole business. The masseur also managed, with at least partial success, to influence Himmler through deliberate misinterpretation of horoscopes, in which Himmler believed more fervently, perhaps, than Hitler himself. From the middle of 1942, Kirsten was busy sowing in Himmler's mind, the notion that he should try to make a separate peace with the Western Allies, though he drew the Reichsfuhrer to the brink on several occasions. He was unable to counteract the awesome power wielded by Hitler himself. As Francis King has pointed out, Hitler's policies as Germany approached its collapse tallied exactly with what could be expected of a black magician packed with evil powers. The essence of such a pact lies in sacrifice, an orgy of blood and destruction. Losses, Hitler told Field Marshal Walter von Reichenau, can never be too high. They sow the seeds of future greatness. And the historian Hugh Trevor Roper said, like an ancient hero, Hitler wished to be sent with human sacrifices to the grave. Hitler, although he knew all hope had gone, waited in his bunker until 30 April 1945 before shooting himself with Eva Braun, whom he had just married. The date was too significant to occultists to be a coincidence. It was the day that ends in the Walpurgis night, the high feast of the powers of darkness. Okay, moving on. On the side of angels, John Dee was a respected scholar who had more than a scholarly interest in magic, for he claimed to have found a way to talk to the angels and use their secrets to develop Enochian magic. Or was he deceived by a sinister and cunning medium? John Dee rates an entry in most standard reference works for his contribution to the mathematical and navigational knowledge of the 16th century England. Yet this same man believed he had learned the secrets of the angels and went on in heaven, and which angels controlled various parts of the world, for example. Did he actually communicate with the angelic spirits? Or was he the victim of self-delusion and the deception of a cunning medium? The majority of those who have studied Dee's life and opinions have come to the latter conclusion. The Biographica Britannica, for example, describes him as having been extremely credulous, extravagantly vain, and a most deluded enthusiast. Occultists tend to take a very different view, particularly those inclined to what has been called the Western esoteric tradition. This is the synthesis of European astrology, ritual magic, alchemy, and other techniques of practical occultism, as developed by S.L. McGregor Mathers and his associates of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn in the late 19th century. It also incorporates some of the principles of Dee's system, called Enochian magic, and based on his presumed mastery of the language of the angels, called Enochian. Many believe that Dee did learn the angel's tongue, and some argue that Enochian magic is of great significance and value. For unlike other systems, it is not concerned with demons or devils, and because the language is of heavenly origin, it is supposed to enable the magician to control spirits more successfully. But whether Dee was wise or foolish, an obsessed eccentric or a magus, there can be no doubt of his scholarship. His library, the printed and manuscript contents of which cost him more than £3,000, somewhere around 150,000 pounds of 1985 value, was a very large one for the period. It included works on every subject with which 16th century scholars concerned themselves: theology, mathematics, geography, navigation, alchemy, astronomy, astrology, and ritual magic. All were represented. Dee was born on 13 July 1527 at Mortlake, now a London suburb, then a pleasant Surrey village. In view of the importance he always attached to astrology, it is interesting to note that at the hour of his birth, the sun was in Cancer and the zodiacal sign of Sagittarius was on the horizon. This combination, according to astrological devotees, is favorable for a career based on scholarship and the study of secret sciences. These astrological indications were certainly confirmed when, at the age of 15, he became an undergraduate at Cambridge and commenced his studies with great intensity. As he himself recorded, I was so vehemently bent to study that for those years I did inviolably keep this order, only to sleep 4 hours every night, to allow to meet and drink and some refreshing after 2 hours every day. And of the other 18 hours, all, except the times of going to and being at divine service, was spent in my studies and learning. These efforts received their due reward, and in 1546 he was appointed Greek underreader, a sort of junior professor, who was also made a fellow of the newly founded Trinity College. But even at this early age of his career, there were whispers that he dabbled in black magic. Some even suspected that an ingenious mechanical beetle he devised for use as a special effect in a Greek play was a creature from hell. The next 30 years or so of Dee's life were eventful, exciting, and sometimes perilous. He traveled widely in Europe, lecturing at ancient universities and making friends among the scholars. He became interested in the angelic magic expounded by Abbot Tritmius in his influential manuscript Steganographia, and he cast the horoscopes of the great men and women of his time. It was this last activity that, in 1553, during the reign of Bloody Mary, brought Dee into danger. At the time, Queen Mary's half-sister, the Princess Elizabeth, was being held in semi-confinement, suspected of plotting with Protestant malcontents to overthrow the Queen and place herself on the throne. Through one of her ladies-in-waiting, Blanche Parry, the princess entered into correspondence with Dee, which eventually resulted in the astrologer showing her Queen Mary's horoscope. Through the agency of two informers, the links between Dee and Elizabeth were conveyed to the Queen's council. Immediately, the unfortunate astrologer was arrested and thrown into prison. Not only were his astrological researches into the probable duration of Mary's life regarded as near treason, but it was believed likely that he was attempting to murder her by black magic. Eventually, Dee was cleared of the charge of treason, but he was immediately rearrested as a suspected heretic. He gained his final release in 1555. In 1558, Mary died and Elizabeth became queen. Dee enjoyed Elizabeth's favor as her astrological advisor. It was he who selected a propitious date for her coronation. It was he who was called upon for advice when it was suspected that sorcery was being employed against her. Nevertheless, Dee's life was not entirely happy. He was perpetually short of money, spending most of his income on his library and his alchemical experiments. And he was distressed by the continual suspicions of many that he was, to quote his own words, a companion of hellhounds and a caller and conjurer of damned and wicked spirits. Talking with angels. It is likely that those who regarded Dee in this light would have believed their worst suspicions confirmed if they had known of Dee's experiments in communication with the angels, which he began in October 1581. The 6 months before this were troubled ones for Dee. His sleep was much disturbed, his dreams were peculiar, and there were mysterious knockings in his house. As the Australian philologist and writer of Enochian magic, Dr. Donald Laycock, had remarked, it would seem that the spirits wished to contact Dee rather than the other way around. Dee worked through a medium, the first being Barnabas Saul, who claimed to be able to see angels and other spirits in a magic crystal. But Dee was not satisfied with Saul and dismissed the seer after a few months. On the 8th of March, 1582, a new medium approached Dee, one Edward Kelly, a strange young man whose antecedents were obscure. He was only 27 years old, but his short life seemed to have been full of mystery, danger, and questionable deeds. He had been a student, but had not taken a degree. He had been a notary and accused of forgery in the course of his work, was said to have had his ears cropped for his offense. He had employed ritual magic in the search of buried treasure. He had studied alchemy and was in possession of strange elixirs, powders, and cipher manuscripts. Most sinister of all, he was reputed to practice necromancy. The ritual of raising the dead for purposes of prediction and divination. At first, Dee was suspicious of Kelly, but not for long. For Kelly was the angel Uriel on Dee's shoe stone, and was given instructions for the manufacture of a powerful talisman, and this convinced Dee of his magical powers. The association between Dee and Kelly lasted for 7 years. The two held hundreds of seances, the first at Mortlake in Surrey, the last at Krakow in Poland. For on the instructions of the angels who spoke through Kelly, the two men and their families wandered thousands of miles up and down Europe. Records of many of their experiments, carefully compiled by Dee, have survived to the present day. They are often virtually meaningless to the modern reader who has not made a specialized study of Elizabethan magic and alchemy. But they do contain passages that seem to be precognitive. Take, for example, the following exchange that took place between Dee and the angel Uriel on the 5th of May, 1583. Dee says, as concerning the vision which was presented yesternight, in parentheses, unlooked for, to the sight of Edward Kelly as he sat at supper with me in my hall. I mean the appearing of the very sea and many ships thereon, and the cutting of the head of a woman by a tall black man. What are we to imagine thereof? Uriel responds, the one did signify the provision of foreign powers against the welfare of this land, which they shall shortly put into practice. The other, the death of the Queen of Scots. It is not long unto it. In other words, Uriel, speaking through Kelly in the year 1583, was specifically prophesying an attempt at the invasion of England by some large fleet, and the execution of Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots. The reference to the executioner as a black man in that day could have meant the executioner in his black hood. Mary was executed in 1587, and the attempted invasion by the Spanish Armada came in 1588. But little of the information supplied by the angels was as specific as this. Much of it consisted of obscure magical, mathematical, and particularly linguistic teaching. The language of Enochian was, according to Uriel and his fellows, that spoken in the Garden of Eden. Lengthy discourses were dictated to Dee in this tongue. At first sight, gibberish. For instance, my cowls Olpert means mighty light, and Bliers Odo means comfort which openest. Sometimes translators were obligingly provided by the angels. From these, it is clear that Enochian is more than mere strings of syllables. It exhibits traces of syntax and grammar and has the rudiments of language. Dr. Laycock has carried out a detailed study of Enochian, and in the introduction to his Complete Enochian Dictionary, 1978, he concludes that its structure and grammar is remarkably similar to English. In spite of his skepticism about the language, Dr. Laycock is prepared to admit that there may be something in Enochian magic. He remarks, I have known well people who have pursued the study of Enochian from the point of view of practical occultism, and who claim that whatever the origin of the system, it works as practical magic. The seance on 17 April 1587 was the beginning of the end for the D. Kelly Association. On that day, an angel calling herself Madimi gave instructions that the two men should sleep with each other's wives. D was deeply disturbed by this, wondering whether devils were impersonating angels, but the spirits urged him on. In hesitating, you sin. All these things are permitted to you. D still hesitated, but on the 22nd of May, gave in, and the wife swap finally took place. This event placed too much of a strain on the D. Kelly relationship, and D returned to England, giving up all his practice of magic. He died in poverty in 1608. Kelly preceded him in death, killed abroad in unknown circumstances in 1595. What of the value of the Enochian magic, the Enochian language, and the other occult teachings conveyed to Dee and Kelly by their supposed angels? No one can be quite sure, but there is a lot to be said for the point of view expressed by Dr. Laycock. Quote, if the true voice of God comes through the shoe stone at all, it is certainly as through a glass darkly. Okay, so we just finished the ritual and magic portion. We're not going to go into alchemists' art. There's a lot of stuff there. I mean, we're not going to read the whole book. Okay, so I'm going to skip to witchcraft, page 206. In those portions, the father of witchcraft, witchcraft and worse, wickedest man in the world. I'm going to talk about Crowley a little bit here. Salem, madness, Salem's grim legacy, and the flower and the skull. Okay. So we might knowledge by numbers might be good. That might relate to some of what Kubrick has been doing. But as far as Eyes Wide Shut is concerned, the ritual and magic section and the witchcraft section are what we're going to be looking at. So let's just go ahead and dive right in. Page 206 here. Okay. Father of witchcraft. Are today's witches practicing an ancient tradition that, as they often claim, dates back to medieval times? Or are they heirs to a relatively new set of beliefs? Where do the roots of modern witchcraft and the occult revival lie? Perhaps one of the oddest and most enduring social phenomenon of the 1960s and the 70s was the so-called occult explosion. Faced with wars, civil strife, growing unemployment, and the ever-present shadow of nuclear war, the young looked towards Eastern mysticism, astrology, alchemy, and even visitors from outer space for solace. For many, witchcraft, the old religion, as they termed it, and those of you familiar with Mark Passio, he always said that the members of the cult that he would uh, talk with always called it the old religion. He said they didn't have a name for it. It's that old. And they just referred to it as the old religion. So it's interesting that we find that here in this book. So moving on. For many, witchcraft, the old religion, as they termed it, provided the answers. Of those who practice it, not a few believe they are involved in what was once the universal religion of Stone Age man. They point out that the very word stems from the Old English Wicca, wise, and the general belief is that the ancient wisdom of the witches, driven underground by persecution during the medieval period, nevertheless endured, springing safely to full bloom again when the last Witchcraft Act of 1735 was repealed in 1951 to be replaced with the Fraudulent Mediums Act. Like all other religious movements, the witchcraft revival and its schisms and breakaway groups had its schisms and breakaway groups, but their basic beliefs and rituals are shared. They see traditional witchcraft as having concerned the world's turning, the growing and ripening of corn, the fertility of animals. Its magic was of the white variety, used to heal and strengthen believers, since it was said that any evil spell would rebound 3 times on its user. Covens, meeting at sabbats, were not devil-worshipping groups blasphemously parodying the Christian Mass, but were simply paying ritual homage with wine, dancing, and occasional sexual activity to the ancient gods and goddesses, Osiris and Isis, Pan and Diana, Cernunnos and Arianrod. By the early 1980s, such a proselytizing had attracted an estimated 100,000 followers in Britain and the United States alone. Though the secrecy that surrounds many groups within the movement makes head counting difficult. The tenets of modern witchcraft are purported to be enshrined in a common manual known as the Book of Shadows. It is claimed that through this book, copied secretly in their own hand of right by successive coven priests and priestesses, the ancient cult has survived for over 1,000 years. One of the main perpetrators of this line of thought was a retired British customs officer named Gerald Brosseau Gardiner. The existence of the Book of Shadows was first revealed in his writings. The question is, did he discover an hereditary cult in Britain that was older than Christianity? Or did he invent much of witchcraft as it is practiced today? I personally think it's the latter. We'll read on and discover. Odd relations. Gardner was born on 13 June 1884 at Great Crosby, Lancashire, the son of a wealthy timber merchant. The entire family were known as eccentrics to the locals. Gerald's older brother seems to have had a dislike of mature. The letter is cut off. This is not a very good PDF. And spent much of his time indoors. Oh, nature. All right. All right, I'll read that again. Gerald's older brother seems to have had a dislike of nature and spent much of his time indoors, shooting small birds from an upper story window with a heavy caliber rifle. Uncle Joe Gardner, who lived across the road, was a religious maniac who loathed Catholicism, published anti-papist tracts, and built churches for both the Methodists and the Anglicans, attending services at each establishment in turn. William Gardner, Gerald's father, was perhaps the oddest of all. When caught in a shower of rain, it was his habit to take off his clothes, fold them neatly, and sit naked upon them until the weather had cleared. Gerald Gardner lived in these surroundings until he was 7. Then he began spending winters abroad with an Irish nanny, Josephine McCombie. For 9 years, they traveled together in the Canary Islands, North Africa, and the Middle East. In 1900, Josephine married a tea planter from Ceylon, now Sri Lanka. Gerald accompanied the newlyweds to Colombo, where for the next 36 years he made his living as a rubber planter and colonial customs officer. He had an eclectic nature, and by the time he came to return to England in 1936, he had become an amateur archaeologist, expert in edged weapons, and a writer, though his existing letters and manuscripts show him to have been nearly dyslexic. He had also developed an interest in mysticism, the occult, and Western spiritualism, which was shared by his wife Donna, whom he had married while on leave in England in 1927. Once back in England, Gardner joined the highly respectable British Folklore Society, eventually becoming a member of the governing council and periodically contributing to the society's journal, Folklore. But alongside his life of fringe academicism ran a parallel, more clandestine existence. In 1939, he claimed to have met an elderly woman whom he named Dorothy, or Daffo. He maintained she was the high priestess of the last remaining coven in Britain, and she was willing to initiate Gardner into her group. It was under her tutelage that Gardner apparently learned of the Book of Shadows. He copied it out by hand, and tradition demanded he should do, or as tradition demanded he should do. He also claimed to have learned how the witches of the New Forest descended by a kind of apostolic succession from the witches of the Middle Ages and beyond. Gardner declared they were witches dedicated to the power of good, despite the persecution they had suffered throughout history, most notably during the witch trials of the medieval period. During the Napoleonic Wars, they had helped to repel a French invasion, and they were to perform a similar service during the Second World War against Hitler. This, at least, is how Gardner told it. They performed their dance rituals in the nude, indulged in ritual bondage and mild flagellation, and at major ceremonies, espats, they undertook the great rite, sexual intercourse between the high priestess and priest in full view of the assembled coven. They appealed to Gerald Gardner enormously. In 1949, according to his own account, Dorothy gave Gardner permission to reveal in a trifle obliquely some of the secrets of the Wicca in a novel entitled High Magic's Aid. Two further, more specific books were to be published with the repeal of the Witchcraft Act. Both caused a minor sensation in the press, and overnight Gardner became notorious. He bought a ruined windmill at Castledown in the Isle of Man, purchased a number of witchcraft relics, and set up a witchcraft museum and a local coven of his own. In 1960, he began traveling again. He died on 12 February 1964, while on a cruise along the North African coast. The publication of his will showed that he died a rich man. His museum and cottage went to his high priestess, Mrs. Monique Wilson, and her husband, and the rest was divided between a few remaining relatives and initiates into the coven. The man behind the magic. On the surface, Gardner appears to have been an academic dilettante, no more outrageous than many a colonial character from the dying days of the British Empire. Unfortunately, there is clear evidence that he was also a fraud of a very shallow kind. The membership list of the Folklore Society for November 1950 ascribes him as holding the degree of Master of Arts and Doctor of Philosophy. In the first edition of the Authors and Writers Who's Who, 1963, he appears to have acquired a doctorate of literature, and it states he was privately educated. In fact, he admitted to Jack Bracelin, one of his followers, who wrote a biography of him in 1960, that he taught himself to read. The suggestion is that he used Strand magazine as his primer during his first sojourn abroad. There is no record of his having either attended a university or been awarded an honorary degree. According to Francis King and Isabel Sutherland in their book, The Rebirth of Magic, Gardner was friendly with J.S.M. Ward, a self-appointed abbot who had been involved in several bogus universities. The chances were that it was from him that Gardner acquired his various doctorates. Nor were his writings unimpeachable. It is perhaps significant that though he was a member of its council for 18 years, the Folklore Society published no obituary of him in its journal. Miss Christina Hull, a leading British folklorist and author and editor of folklore, wrote to writer Frank Smythe in 1969 to explain Dr. Gardner had a very curious personality. It did not inspire confidence, at least not in me, nor in a number of people interested in witchcraft and kindred matters. His theories were in themselves somewhat peculiar. I remember a meeting when the composition of the council for the following year was discussed, and the question raised as to whether his presence was really advantageous to the society. Nothing was done about it, and his name was allowed to go forward as before, but the doubt was clearly felt and expressed. In 1954, Stuart Sanderson, director of the Institute of Dialect and Folklife Studies at Leeds University, was at an international conference on maritime folklore at which Gardner was giving a paper. His thesis on the development of the Manx fishing craft appeared on the surface to be a superb piece of research. However, Sanderson thought it rather odd that the article gave no reference or acknowledgments to earlier studies on the subject. As he recalls, it was in fact a scissors and paste job with a sprinkling of folklore beliefs at the end, based on Basil and Eleanor McGaw's The Development of the Manx Fishing Craft in the Proceedings of the Isle of Man Natural History and Antiquarian Society. Gardner had not based his entire paper on the McGaw's work, but had had the good grace to pepper it with material from another article that had appeared in Mariner's Mirror in April 1941. If he was willing or reckless enough to risk exposure on such well-documented subjects, how far can his testimony be trusted on the subject of the Wicca? Gardner's sources. The actual rituals, beliefs, and text of the Book of Shadows that Gardner claimed were handed on to him by Dorothy appeared in full several times in the 1970s. And on examination, the rituals described appear to be very much a scissors and paste job. Their most immediate source of the work of Dr. Margaret Murray is the work of Dr. Margaret Murray. She was the first to propound the theory in the 1940s that witchcraft was an organized underground religion. A distinguished professor of Egyptology, Dr. Murray's witchcraft theories have nevertheless been squarely refuted by medieval and anthropological scholars. Other sources are not difficult to find. Gardner drew on Charles Leland's Aradia, 1897, de Givry's Witchcraft, Magic, and Alchemy, which appeared in its first English translation in 1931, and on Aleister Crowley's inspired prose poem, Book of the Law. S.L. MacGregor Mathers's edition of the Greater Key of Solomon, a 15th century magical grimoire, Handbook of Ritual Magic, was also grist to the Gardner Mill. In addition, many of the rituals of the Order of the Golden Dawn, co-founded by Mathers in 1888, found their way into Gardner's opus. Even a rustic-sounding verse by Rudyard Kipling was topped, tailed, and slightly altered to fit his August Eve rite. In short, Gardner's Book of Shadows was a fake, with many of the statements contained therein being historically inaccurate. Take, for example, his suggestion that Dorothy and her followers believed in reincarnation. Commitment to such a doctrine immediately places the coven very firmly in the post-1870s, since in the medieval period, the concept of reincarnation did not exist except in the modified form of a belief in the transmigration of souls. More importantly, there is no trace of witchcraft of the type condemned during the Middle Ages ever having been an organized practice at all. The great witch hunts that raged throughout Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries cannot be taken as evidence that a diabolical religion opposed to Christianity exists. Such a notion was a fantasy born in the minds of the late medieval inquisitors who believed any practices existing outside the strict framework of Christianity as devil worship. Men who masterminded the purges did so from confused beliefs both about the dualist heresies of such groups as the Manichees and the Cathars, and about ritual magic, though invariably this was practiced by individuals. Of course, once the purges got underway, many witches came forward and confessed to having flown to the Sabbath on broomsticks. Often they made their confessions under torture, and when they came forward for their own violation, incriminating themselves and often neighbors too, they were simply responding to the climate that the inquisitors had created with all their talk of devils and demons. However, the interesting point about Gardner's Wicca is that despite its fraudulent beginnings, it has grown under the hands of sincere, if misguided, believers to be a viable religious movement which seems to fulfill deep psychological needs that the more orthodox churches have failed to supply. Witchcraft and worse. People fear witchcraft because they believe it has a supernatural capacity to harm them. But does it really have the magical powers that its adherents claim? On 9 March 1967, an odd advertisement appeared in the personal columns of the Times. A witch of full powers is urgently thought to lift a 73-year-old curse and help restore the family's fortunes of an afflicted nobleman. Employment genuinely offered. Some days later, it was revealed that the advertiser was the bankrupt 74-year-old Duke of Leinster, head of one of Britain's oldest families. Over 170 people offered assistance. Whether or not witchcraft helped the destitute Duke was able to pay off his debts and was welcomed back into society before his death in the 1970s. Some of the witches who came to the aging aristocrat's aid were followers of Gerald Gardner, who, as we have seen, invented much of modern witchcraft. Others were members of independent covens, and some were lone operators. All of them believed, or apparently believed, that they were inheritors of a craft that had possessed, like the carpenter's craft, from master to apprentice through the ages. Can any of their claims to magical powers be historically substantiated? To begin with, there appears to have been no time or place on earth where witchcraft and magic have not been practiced. Man's attempt to control and come to terms with exterior natural phenomenon through ritual and ceremony is an essential part of his way of thinking and behaving. The evidence of primitive sculpture and cave painting suggests the eternal preoccupation of man with magic and its effect on fertility, rainmaking, success in hunting, the warding off of sickness and evil influences, modern witches, students of Gardner, who claim these are their concerns too. As Montague Summers put it, the reason why man came forth believing in terrors and evils is simply that terrors and evils were there and very real, and the simplicity of primitive man was sensibly conscious of their activities and of their presence all about them. By the time of the earliest written texts on magic, the Akkadian Chaldean inscriptions of Nineveh, dating back from the second millennium BC, the practice of black and white magic had already developed into what E.M. Butler in Ritual Magic termed an extremely elaborate and well-developed demonology. And the practices described are almost identical to those associated with European witches in the Middle Ages. One inscription reads, "He who has fashioned images corresponding to my whole appearance has bewitched my whole appearance. He has seized the magic draught prepared for me and has soiled my garments. He has torn my garments and has mingled his magic herb with the dust of my feet. May the fire god, the hero, turn their magic to naught." The persecution of witches followed a familiar pattern too. Hammurabi of Nineveh, in a legal code dating from the 17th century BC, laid down that if a man has laid a charge of witchcraft on another man and has not justified it, he upon whom the witchcraft charge is laid shall go to the holy river, and if the holy river overcome him, he who accused him shall take to himself his house. The rules are rather different from the 17th century East Anglican witch floating, but the instinct is the same. Between Nineveh and Babylon, the Greco-Egyptians and the Jewish authors of the Kabbalah lies a certain continuity of magical method and belief. Love spells demanding the decapitation of white cockerels and the drinking of animal blood, for example, become commonplace, as does the gathering of herbs for potions. The Bible describes several encounters of witches, notably that between Saul and the witch of Endor. It condemns them too, in texts that were used by the medieval inquisitors or inquisitor to justify their own orgies of torture and burning. And wrongly too, as it happens, since as early as 1584, Reginald Scott, in Discovery of Witchcraft, had pointed out that the most famous anti-witch text of all, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live," properly translates as "Thou shalt not suffer poisoners to live." However, although the Bible takes individual practitioners of witchcraft as a matter of course, there is no evidence whatsoever to suggest that it was an organized religion of the kind claimed by Gerald Gardner and his followers. Mass necromancy. Many of the writers of ancient Greece mentioned witchcraft as a particular reality, with necromancy, the raising of the dead, as one of its principal aims. Aeschylus, in his play The Persians, described the raising of Darius, while Homer, in his 9th book of the Odyssey, tells of a mass raising in gory detail. The Romans, Tacitus, Virgil, Horace, Tibullus, Villi, and Pliny all describe witches as commonplace, and there is no doubt that witchcraft spread throughout the Roman Empire. After the breakup of the empire in Britain, however, there are few literary mentions of witches except as mild offenders against the law. In the Saxon period, an edict was issued against those who practice any heathenship or in any way love witchcraft. The penalty for such a crime was 10 half marks, half to Christ, half to the king, under Aethelstan in AD 924. Even when witchcraft had apparently been responsible for death, the punishment was only 120 days imprisonment. This was rather more lenient than the law issued by the pious King Edgar in AD 959, who ordained death for anyone disobeying his edict on the Christian feast days, well worshippings, and necromancies, and divinations, and heathen songs, and devil's games be abstained from. Undoubtedly, during this period, there were still lingering traces of primitive heathenism, the real old religion of the pre-Christian era, throughout Britain. Many people clung determinedly to their old gods for several centuries after missionaries such as Aidan and Columba had begun preaching the gospel. But those who continued to worship in the old ways were not, by definition, practitioners of witchcraft. In late Saxon and Norman times, there were indeed witches, but they tended to operate alone. William the Conqueror, for instance, called one in to disconcert by her magic all the warlike devices of the Saxons at the siege of Ely in 1071. She was placed on a wooden siege tower that was promptly burned down by the defenders led by Hereward the Great, the Wake. Hereward the Wake. It was not until almost 100 years later, with the founding of the Inquisition in 1163 by the Council of Tours, that the Church began to confuse primitive witchcraft with the beliefs of such heretical sects as the Cathars and the Manichees. This misplaced notion gave rise to the ideas of Satanism and group devil worship by coines, Old French for coming together or conspiracy. So they began the systematic persecution of people purported to be in cahoots with the devil. Why did the church determine to stamp out the Cathars and the Manichees? The theology behind their reasoning is complex, but was rooted in the ideas of a dualism, with God on one side and the powers of evil Satan on the other, while the church held that Satan was the lesser power operating within the permission granted him by God. Their opponents saw God and the devil as equals engaged in an internal running fight with mankind as the battleground. Once the great machinery of the Inquisition got rolling, there was to be no stopping it. With time, it would crush the Manichees, the Waldensians, the Cathars, and the Knights Templar, before moving on to destroy individuals whose only crime may have been to foresee a neighbor's death in a dream. In such an environment, it was unlikely that the simple witchcraft of village wise men and women could survive for long. before entangled with charges of heresy. Gradually, the process of trying and condemning witches became entirely divorced from ordinary law. Lawyers and judges were no longer needed, and in 1398, the University of Paris opened further floodgates by decreeing that any superstitious practice that had results that could not reasonably be accredited to God and nature had to be the result of a pact with the devil. That and subsequent judgments spread terror throughout Europe. Witches and demons were everywhere, ready to strike down Christians, blight their crops, render them impotent, and destroy their souls. No doubt, many of the accused actually believed themselves to be witches, and for every 10 innocents tortured to extract a confession of guilt, there were probably an equal number who volunteered a confession, convinced that they were genuinely possessed by demons. Such a phenomenon is well known to modern police officers. Whenever a particularly sensational murder is committed, neither is it unknown for a spate of imitative crimes to follow shortly after a well-publicized killing. It is agreed that group witchcraft was originally the invention of the Inquisition, but it is probable that in some isolated cases, a strong leader could delude a group of his or her neighbors into joining a coven for the thrill of it. Undoubtedly, there were and still are individuals with strange powers. However, the traditional belief that they are the seventh child of a seventh child is not so much a statement of fact as an indication of their rarity. The more down-to-earth lore associated with country witchcraft today, wart curing, the knowledge of herbs, and the habits of animals, was widespread in a pre-industrial age simply because people were closer to nature, for instance. They grew up knowing about the magic properties of the plants that surrounded them. Today, when such skills are practiced, they naturally smack of the truly occult in the sense of hidden skill. Curiously, it was a member of the Spanish Inquisition, Alonso de Salazar Frias, who in 1611 pronounced an opinion that may well have applied not only to his own time, but to the myriad witch cults spawned in Britain and the United States since the 1960s. Over a period of 8 weeks, he talked to 1,800 witches, many of whom had made voluntary confessions. His approach was astonishingly open-minded and his conclusion salutary. Considering the above with all the Christian attention in my power, I have not found even indications from which to infer that a single act of witchcraft has really occurred. I deduce the importance of silence and reserve from the experience that these were neither witches nor bewitched until they were talked and written about. Okay, there he is. The wickedest man in the world. Aleister Crowley, one of the most infamous Englishmen of the 20th century, had many interests: mountaineering, poetry, drugs, pornography, and magic. This mysterious and sinister man believed he was the beast of the Book of Revelation. In the late 20th century, psychical researchers who tend to call themselves parapsychologists largely concern themselves with mental phenomena such as telepathy and precognition. However important the scientific implications of such supposed phenomenon, there can be no doubt that they are less spectacular than the alleged physical phenomenon of mediumship. Such things as invitation and materializations of departed spirits, which were the main focus of psychic investigation during the period 1860 to 1930. At the time, there were many physical mediums. The most notable of them, apart from the Victorian levitator D.D. Home, letters are cut off. It's a name, something Eusebia Palladino, an Italian medium whose powers impressed such serious researchers as Everard Fielding and Hereward Barrington. I'm missing the letter, like it's cut off. So imagine what first letter you want. Maybe I just chose a B, but anyway. But one amateur investigator in particular was not at all impressed. After a sitting with Palladino, he came to the conclusion that she was no more than a clever illusionist, and that all those who had recorded her supernatural spats, notably the extrusion of a phantom ectoplasmic limb, had been duped. The seance in question took place in 1913, and the researcher was trying to answer one question that had presented itself to his mind. Fielding and the rest are clever, wary, experienced, and critical, but even so, can I be there that when they describe what occurs, they are dependable witnesses? I'm sorry, guys. This PDF just slices off the edge of I'm losing letters here on the left side. Those watching can see. Palladino sat at the end of a table. At her back, a curtained cabinet containing a stand in which were placed the various objects intended to be manipulated by her ghostly something. Her right wrist was gripped by Mary S.D. Sturgis, her left by the investigator who had arranged the sitting. The seance began in a way typical of many Palladino sittings. The curtain over the cabinet first bulged and then fell across the medium's left arm and hand, and the investigator's right hand and arm. By turning his head, the researcher could now see to the cabinet where he glimpsed the movements of a shadowy left arm. He reasoned to himself that this could not be the medium's left arm, as he himself was holding it. But as the mysterious arm disappeared from view, he suddenly felt Palladino's wrist slipping into his hand, although he had never been conscious of it ever leaving his grasp. This minor but significant incident led the researcher to discount all the reports given by others who had attended Palladino's seances. If I, he argued, cannot be relied upon to say whether I am or not holding a woman's wrist, is it not plausible that even experts, admittedly excited by the rapidity with which one startling phenomenon succeeds another, may deceive themselves as to the conditions of the control? The investigator went on to have sittings with other mediums and to study the findings of other physical researchers. As a result, he became a complete skeptic, deciding that almost all the reported phenomenon of the seance room were the outcome of fraud and self-deception. Enter Aleister Crowley. Yet it is perhaps surprising that this particular investigator came to such negative conclusions, for far from being a pure materialist, he was himself a dedicated occultist. He was none other than Aleister Crowley, the practicing ritual magician who, in the 1920s, was denounced as the wickedest man in the world. His combination of total belief in spiritualist mediumship with total belief in ritual magic was typical of the man. A thread of ambivalence and paradox ran through his life, his teachings, and his relationship with others. Edward Alexander Crowley, later he abandoned his Christian names in favor of the strangely spelt Aleister, was born in October 1875. His parents were members of the Plymouth Brethren, that most rigid of Protestant sects, and they brought up their only son in all its rigid beliefs, that every word of the Bible was the literal truth, inspired by the Holy Spirit, and the Catholic and Anglican churches were synagogues of Satan, that the overwhelming majority of mankind was doomed by a just God to roast in hellfire for all eternity. The elder Crowley died in 1887, and young Aleister became the object of his mother's fanatical venom. On more than one occasion, she accused him of being the actual great beast of the book of Revelation, whose number is said to be 666. To the end of his life, Crowley did everything he could to live up to this archetypal image. He may even have come to believe he really was the biblical beast. He was sent away to a school run for the sons of brethren. Here his experiences were such that he lost his Christian faith and acquired a hatred of the brethren and their beliefs that was to survive throughout his long and eventful life. In October 1895, Crowley, in possession of a fortune of 30,000 pounds that he had inherited on reaching the age of 21, became a student of Trinity College, Cambridge. His 3 years at the university were happy ones. He collected rare occult books, wrote much poetry, spent his holidays climbing the Alps, and became interested in the occult. This led him in 1898 to become a neophyte, a student member of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, a semi-secret society devoted to a study of the occult arts and sciences, including the evocation of spirits, divination, and even alchemy. Crowley considered most of his fellow members of the Golden Dawn to be absolute openities, I don't know. But he was impressed by the occult magic abilities of two of them, Cecil something and Alan Bennett. The latter took up residence with Crowley in his London flat, and together the two carried out many occult experiments, among them the consecration Uh, the charging with magical powers of a talisman intended to cure a certain Lady Hall of a serious illness. This was duly prepared and handed over. Unfortunately, however, neither Lady Hall uh, nor her daughter followed Crowley's precise instructions, so that when the talisman was applied to the venerable old lady, she was seized with a violent series of fits and nearly died. The consecration that produced these unpleasant effects was probably carried out in what Crowley called the White Temple, a room lined with mirrors and devoted to white magic. But his flat also included another room, the Black Temple, in which the altar was supported by the image of a Negro standing on his hands, and which contained a skeleton to which Crowley was silly enough to sacrifice sparrows. Invisible vandals. There seems to have been a thoroughly sinister atmosphere about Crowley's flat. One evening in 1899, he and a friend, also an occultist, went out to dinner. On their return, they found that the locked door of the White Temple had been mysteriously opened, its furniture overturned, and the magical symbols that it held scattered about around the room. As Crowley and his friend restored the room to order, they clairvoyantly observed semi-materialized beings marching around the main room in almost unending procession. In 1900, the Golden Dawn split into two competing factions. Crowley managed to quarrel with both of them, and for the next 3 years or so lost interest in Western occultism. Instead, he wrote poetry, traveled the world, and got married to a lady whom he called Uarda the Seer, although she knew little about the occult and probably cared less. In March 1904, the two were staying in Cairo. Crowley, wanting to demonstrate his occult abilities to his wife, carried out a number of magical rites. The results, if Crowley's written records are to be believed, were startling. He received a psychic message flashed into his brain from some unknown source, which told him that a new epoch in history was about to begin. He, Crowley, had been chosen to be the prophet of this new age. Crowley's wife also received a message. Her husband was to sit down for 1 hour on 3 consecutive days with a pen and paper before him. The gods would then dictate to him, in voices audible only to their chosen prophet, the gospel of the new age that was about to dawn. Crowley obeyed the directions. He heard a voice, presumably originating in the depths of his own mind, and wrote down the words dictated to him. The result was the Book of the Law, a prose poem which Crowley came to believe was literally inspired in precisely the same way that his parents had believed the Bible to be inspired. The meaning of some parts of the Book of the Law is obscure. Even Crowley admitted that some passages of it were beyond his own comprehension. But the basic message was clear. Crowley was to be the prophet of a new age of Horus. In the new age, all the old religions of mankind, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, will pass away and be replaced by a new faith of force and fire, the basic moral principle of which will be complete self-fulfillment. For every man and woman is a star. In other words, each individual has an absolute right to develop in his or her own way. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, says the new gospel. For thou hast no right but to do thy will, and the word of sin is restriction. In fairness to Crowley and his followers, it has to be emphasized that the former was always careful to point out that do what thou wilt is not quite the same as do what you like. When the book of the law says do what thou wilt, claimed Crowley, it means find the way of life that is in accordance with your inmost nature and then live it to the full. For some years, Crowley only half believed in the truth of the importance of the book of the law. But by 1910, it had mastered him, and he devoted the rest of his life to spreading its message and converting others to the belief that he, Aleister Crowley, was a new Messiah. The methods he adopted to achieve these ends included the authorship of numerous books, most of them eventually published at the expense of himself and his friends and followers, and setting up of 2 occult fraternities, the public performance of occult ceremonies at London's Caxton Hall, and even the establishment of an abbey situated in a slightly derelict Sicilian farmhouse, the inmates of which devoted themselves to the practices of the new faith. In the years before the outbreak of the First World War, Crowley and a few disciples carried out an intensive propaganda campaign in England. This, although it costs all Crowley's money, and much of that belonging to his friends, was notably unsuccessful. Few converts were made, and Crowley was subjected to much unfavorable publicity. In 1914, Crowley took himself and his new faith to the United States, where so he hoped people would be more receptive to the new gospel and magic. Crowley's occultism or occult system derived from his own synthesis of Western occultism, the teachings contained in the Book of the Law, and the tantrism of yogic theory and practice, largely concerned with sexuality, that he had learned from Eastern sources. Sorry about that. Paragraph is chopped. But the New World proved even more resistant to Crowley than the Old. The 6 years the self-proclaimed prophet spent in America were unhappy. He was perpetually short of money, made few converts, and was accused of being a traitor to his own country. And reasonably enough, for until the United States' entry into the war in 1917, he earned a scanty living by editing a pro-German propaganda sheet. In 1920, he returned to Europe along with 2 mistresses. Crowley always maintained a vigorous sexual life and set up his Abbey of Thelema, a magical word implying new aeon, but Crowley often translated it as will, in Sicily. For a time, this enjoyed a modest success. The Sicilians were surprisingly tolerant of Crowley and his magic, and a number of his disciples, actual and potential, made their way to the abbey. These included Jane Wolfe, a minor Hollywood star, Norman Mudd, a one-eyed professor of mathematics, and Raoul Loveday, a brilliant young Oxford graduate who had decided to devote his life to Crowley's new religion. We also know that Barbara Bush's mom went to visit and did some sexual rites there before Barbara was born. That's beside the point. Loveday died while at the Abbey, probably of enteritis. His wife, who believed that her husband had been poisoned by some blood he had drunk in the course of an occult ceremony, returned to London and began a virulent newspaper campaign against Crowley. Eventually, this campaign, which included the denunciation of Crowley as a beast in human form, led to the closure of the Abbey. The Sicilian authorities promptly deported him. The remainder of Crowley's life was, in many ways, an anticlimax. He wandered through Europe, a lonely and increasingly unhappy man, and eventually died in 1947. At the time of Crowley's death, he had only a handful of followers. Today, he has many thousands. In some way, his teachings seem now more in tune with the times than they were during his lifetime. Mad, bad, and dangerous to know. When Aleister Crowley, the Beast, died in 1947, it seemed that for all their notoriety, his life and his magic would soon be forgotten. But the years since his death have seen an explosion of interest in Crowleyanity. There he is with his opium pipe or whatever it is. Notice his eyebrows. Looks like Aquino was trying to copy that. Moving on. Aleister Crowley died in 1947 in comparative obscurity. There was, it is true, a slight fuss over his memorial service, which took place in the chapel of the crematorium at Brighton, Sussex, and was denounced by some pompous local councillors as a black mass. In reality, the ceremony was totally innocent, consisting of no more than the writer Lewis Wilkinson reading aloud some of Crowley's poetry and prose. The matter was soon forgotten. It seemed likely that, after a few years, only a tiny band of dedicated occultists would remember Crowley, his magic, and the Book of the Law, which, Crowley insisted, and seems genuinely to have believed, had been dictated to him by a superhuman being and was destined to be the gospel of the new age. 10 years after his death, however, there were signs of a revival of interest in Crowley's life and opinions. John Simons's study of Crowley's occult practices, The Magic of Aleister Crowley, drew some attention. Second-hand copies of Crowley's books, once almost unsaleable, began to command high prices. Perhaps most significant of all, some of the beat poets of the California discovered the similarities between some of Crowley's teachings and the sexual mysticism with which they had become acquainted through translations of obscure Buddhist and Hindu treatises. Crowley crazy. By the end of the 1960s, a Crowley revival was apparent. The Beatles included his photograph as one of the people we like. on the sleeve of their Sergeant Pepper album, an abbey of Thelema, better organized than its Sicilian predecessor, which Crowley had run in the 1920s, flourished in rural Switzerland, and most of Crowley's occult writings, although not his poetry, had been reprinted and was selling in substantial numbers. In the 1980s, his revival was showing no signs of abating. In California, an occult brotherhood once led by Crowley flourished under the leadership of Grady McMurtry. Many fortune tellers employ the Thoth tarot cards designed by Crowley and Lady Frida Harris, and all over the world, little groups of occultists study Crowley's writings and practice the magical techniques taught by him. Clearly enough, there is something in magic, spelled with a K, that is in tune with the times we live in. The system that Crowley constructed from elements derived from Western occultism, from Tantrism, sexual yoga, and from the demonic prose of the Book of the Law may be complete rubbish, may be of great importance, may combine some worthless features with others of great value, but clearly makes a genuine appeal to some people inclined to the mystical and magical studies. The Western occultism that Crowley incorporated into magic was the Western esoteric tradition, itself a synthetic system built up from disparate elements and combined into one harmonious, although artificial, whole. The Western esoteric tradition was created in the last decade of the 19th century by S.L. MacGregor Mathers, head of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, the magical brotherhood into which Crowley had been initiated in 1898. Mathers had taken such occult arts as astrology, cartomancy, fortune telling by cards, alchemy, ritual magic, the strange Enochian occult system derived from the Elizabethan John Dee, and astral projection, and blended them with one another. The Mathers system, described at length in many books by Dr. Israel Regardie, has been and is found by many to be a satisfactory guide to occult theory and practice. Those who have practiced the whole system claim that it works, that it induces profound and valuable psychological and spiritual changes in its devotees. Nevertheless, it must be admitted that Mathers' system, later incorporated almost in its entirety into Crowley's magic, shows signs of straining after an artificial unity. Thus, to give one example, the system attributes the 78 cards of the tarot pack to the various degrees of the zodiac used by astrologers, to various segments of the Hebrew mystical diagram known as the Tree of Life, and even to various Enochian letters copied down by Dr. Dee at the dictation of the angels, with whom he and his medium, Edward Kelly, believed themselves to be in communication. Mathers made these attributions because, following the French occult writer Eliphas Levi, he believed that the tarot cards were of ancient origin, mystical instructions in pictorial form designed by the Egyptian priests who served Thoth, god of wisdom. Crowley, following Mathers, also accepted this, going as far as to call his treatise on the tarot the Book of Thoth. In fact, there is no evidence at all that the tarot cards originated before the later Middle Ages, at which time, and for centuries afterwards, they were used only for playing games. It is interesting to note that occultists were not concerned with the tarot cards before about 1780, and that surprisingly enough, there is no evidence of them having been used for fortune-telling purposes before that date. In spite of the artificiality of the Mathers system, it is internally coherent, intellectually attractive enough in its own way, and more importantly, those who have used it have found it effective. In spite of its almost glib eclecticism, it is perhaps the strongest of the three strands that Crowley plaited into the rope of his magic. However, Crowley himself would not have believed this. As far as he was concerned, the Book of the Law, with its doctrine of the coming age of force and fire, of which he himself was to be the new Messiah, was central to his teachings. Although he was never confident that he had fully mastered the book's meaning, it is certain that the book's meaning mastered him. He devoted his life to the propagation of its gospel. He studied every word of its text with the same fanatical devotion that the Christian parents had devoted to the Bible. And whether he was perplexed and in need of guidance, he would open it at random and take the sentence his finger alighted upon as a direct message from the God. His attitude towards the Book of the Law was totally uncritical. As far as he was concerned, it was beyond criticism. Thus, he was in the habit of opening its conversations with everyone with a direct quotation from it. "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." On one occasion, he said this to the painter Augustus John, who testily replied, "To hell with all laws." Crowley felt, perhaps for the only time in his life, shocked. Today, Crowley's disciples study the Book of the Law with the same obsessive concern as their master. All religious texts are liable to conflicting interpretation, and the Book of the Law is no exception. One contemporary group, for example, is the custodian of a special revelation concerning the relationship between the book and the 10th planet of the solar system, supposedly in an orbit beyond that of Pluto, called Isis. On the whole, it seems likely that the Book of the Law is, as far as magic is concerned, a source of weakness rather than strength, for its phraseology is so vague that conflicting readings of its text tend to lead to internal disagreements and schisms in the occult groups that accept its divine inspiration. Sex as a sacrament. The third element in magic, and perhaps the one that has received most public attention, is its tantrism, sexual mysticism and magic. Tantrism is a powerful element in both the Hinduism of Bengal and Tibetan Buddhism. It is concerned with the use of sexuality, expressed sometimes physically, sometimes only symbolically, as a sacrament leading its devotees toward mystical union with the gods. Crowley may have come into contact with it in the course of his Oriental travels, but the main source of the sexual magic techniques that he taught, practiced, and incorporated into magic was a German occult society called the Ordo Templi Orientis, or the Order of Templars of the Orient. Crowley met and became friendly with the chief of this fraternity, and a somewhat dubious individual called Theodore Roos, who headed several pseudo-Masonic lodges in 1911. In the following year, Crowley was appointed head of its British section, taking the imposing but perhaps ludicrous title of Baphomet, Supreme and Holy King of the Ireland, Iona, and all the Britons within the sanctuary of the Gnosis. The sex magic of the OTO would seem certainly to the outside observer to be on a somewhat lower plane than that of authentic Tantrism. Crowley's own diaries, his magical record, make it apparent that he used it more in order to obtain his material desires, money and power over others, than to attain the enlightenment that is alike the goal of the Hindu and Buddhist Tantrism. Crowley wrote several instructional manuscripts, most of them now published, in which he codified Roos's sexual teachings. They are largely concerned with complex visualization exercises designed to be used in conjunction with sexual activity. These, then, are the three strands that make up Crowley's magic. Only time will show whether all or any of them contain something of permanent value to students of the occult. But one thing seems certain: Crowley was not, in the ordinary sense of the word, a charlatan. There were elements of a showman, the charlatan, and the confidence trickster in his personality, but he believed in his self-formulated system. He worked for it, suffered for it, and devoted his life to it. But sadly, it may all have been a delusion. It is said that his last words, uttered in a seedy boarding house in Hastings, Sussex, were, "I am perplexed." So moving on to a place that I personally know very well in the Common Era, Salem, Massachusetts. Salem, that way madness lies. The very words witch hunt summon up a picture of mindless, hysterical persecution of the innocent, which would aptly describe the ugly events of Salem, Massachusetts in the 17th century. Just after Christmas, 1691, 7 young girls of Salem Village in Essex County, Massachusetts, United States, took up fortune telling in order to while away the long winter months. They used an egg poured into a wine glass as a crystal ball in an attempt to see their future husbands. Instead, according to the Reverend John Hale of nearby Beverly, there came up a coffin, that is, a specter in likeness of a coffin. It was an apt omen. 10 months later, as a direct result of the girls' experiments, the little Puritan community lay devastated. 20 people had been executed for witchcraft, while over 100 more lay in prison, their property confiscated, and the name of Salem changed to Danvers in the 20th century, had become a synonym for mindless persecution. As a Boston merchant, Thomas Brattle wrote prophetically, "I am afraid ages will not wear off that reproach and those stains which these things will leave behind them upon our land. Compared with the great witch hunts of Europe, that of Salem was insignificant. In the mid-17th century, for instance, an estimated 900 witches had been burned in the city of Bamberg alone, and 5,000 in the province of Alsace, while in the English country of Essex, from which the Massachusetts district took its name, the witch finder general, Matthew Hopkins, had dispatched to the gallows at least twice as many victims as were to hang in Salem. Salem's abiding horror lies in the fact that it was the last major instance of a sober, rational, and industrious society riving itself apart literally through fear of the devil. The details of how it did so exist in abundance in voluminous court records, over 50 written confessions, ecclesiastical journals, and contemporary letters. Despite 2 centuries of historical analysis, the reason why the reign of terror took place still remains largely conjectural. When these calamities first began, wrote the Reverend Samuel Parris, which was in my own family, the affliction was several weeks before such hellish operations as witchcraft were suspected. Parris was minister of Salem Village, and like the majority of Massachusetts clergymen of the time, a Puritan. However, the New England Puritans had, by the 1690s, become a remarkably tolerant and well-balanced society. Ingersoll's Tavern in Salem Village was patronized by clergy and laity alike. People living in sin were frowned upon, but unmolested, and true poverty was almost non-existent. Intellectually, standards were high. Harvard University, on the outskirts of Boston, 15 miles, 24 kilometers to the south of Salem Village, was founded largely through the effort of Reverend Increase Mather, who was to play a prominent advisory part in the witchcraft trials, while Samuel Sewall, one of the Salem judges, was writing his tract, The Selling of Joseph, the first anti-slavery pamphlet published in America. Too tolerant to be true? Prosecutions of witchcraft, despite a widespread belief in the devil and his works, were rare. Only half a dozen witches had been hanged in the province during the entire 17th century, while a handful more were sentenced to the relatively mild punishments of whipping, fines, or exile. In fact, almost every village had its wise man or woman to whom the residents went for healing potions and love charms. The Reverend Cotton Mather, Increase's son, who was to gain an unjustly infamous name during the Salem persecutions, took a tolerant and relatively scientific interest in witchcraft. A former medical student and fellow of the Royal Society, he invited a number of possessed persons into his own home, first searching of signs of organic illness before treating them through prayer and fasting. It was to prayer and fasting that the Reverend Parris turned when his 9-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, and 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams, began to throw fits after experimenting with the glass and egg. 5 other girls were also affected, 12-year-old Ann Putnam, and 4 other girls, Elizabeth Hubbard, Mary Walcott, Mary Warren, and Mercy Lewis. whose ages ranged from 16 to 20. The Reverend Paris wisely removed his daughter and niece to the home of a friend in Salem Town, 5 miles away. The remaining 5 were to form the accusers. Their motions in their fits are preternatural, wrote the Reverend Dodot Lawson, both as to the manner which is so strange as a well person could not screw their body into, and as to the violence, it is much beyond the ordinary force of the same person when they are in their right mind. Later, the girls suffered hallucinations, seeing spectral figures who beat, scratched, and bit them, often leaving actual marks on their flesh, and struck them temporarily blind, deaf, and dumb. They also suffered loss of appetite and had choking attacks. In fact, they all exhibited classic symptoms of what is now recognized as hysteria in the clinical rather than the colloquial sense of the word. As one modern author, Chadwick Hansen, puts it, with minor exceptions, the girl's behavior belongs to the history of pathology rather than the history of fraud. But practical psychiatry lay 200 years in the future. When the Reverend Paris finally took the girls to the local doctor, William Griggs, he announced, "The evil hand is upon them." In other words, he believed they were bewitched. The dog it was. That having been established, at least the lay people of Salem knew what to do. Mary Walcott's aunt, Mary Sibley, visited the Reverend Paris's Caribbean Indian slaves, John and Tituba, and asked them to bake a cake of meal mixed with the girl's urine, an ancient counterspell against spells and curses, which on 25 February 1692 was fed to the Paris family dog. The spell worked. The dog died, and the girls were able to name their tormentors. Tituba the slave was two local wise women, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne. When he heard about the cake, the Reverend Paris was appalled. Like other contemporary clergymen, he believed that counterspells were as sinful as the original spells. Through the witch cake, he said, the devil hath been raised among us, and his rage is vehement and terrible. And when he shall be silenced, the Lord only knows. Paris spoke more truthfully than he knew, but the revelation of guilty names had set the wheels of justice in motion. For on 29 February, 4 yeomen of Salem village swore out warrants for the arrest of Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne. And the following day, they were brought before the community's 2 magistrates, John Hawthorne and Jonathan Corwin. Hawthorne, in particular, seems instantly to have adopted an inquisitorial rather than magisterial role, assuming the guilt of the parties before they were even asked to plead. Sarah Good, he asked, "What evil spirits have you familiarity with? Have you made no contact with the devil? Why do you thus torment these children?" And so on. In the case of Sarah Good, he may have felt justified, for her own husband, William, testified that he thought she was either a witch or would be one very quickly because of her bad carriage to him. And her 4-year-old daughter, Dorcas, claimed that her mother kept black and yellow birds as familiars and hurt the children and afflicted persons. When the girls were asked to face Sarah Good and say whether she was one of their tormentors, they all immediately fell into fits and were dreadfully tortured and tormented for a short space of time. When recovered, they said that Good's specter had come and tormented them, though her body remained at a considerable distance from them. This introduction of what became known as spectral evidence was to be the cause of dissension between the clergy and the judiciary. Among its prominent opponents was Cotton Mather, who pointed out that the odd effects produced upon the sufferers by the look or touch of the accused are things wherein the devils may as much impose upon some harmless people as by the representation of their shapes. In other words, if the devil had power to run loose in Salem, he also had, in the words of Hamlet, power to assume a pleasing shape. Only clear evidence of a pact between an accused person and the devil should be admitted, insisted Mather. Otherwise, innocent, virtuous people were at risk. But the magistrates were, perhaps understandably, impressed by the fact that the girls flew into fits when faced with or touched by an accused person. In vain, Robert Pike, a magistrate from near Salisbury, pointed out that it would be the height of folly for a person pleading innocent to charge of witchcraft at the same time to perform acts of witchcraft in the courtroom by causing the girls to have fits. Self-interest, he said, teaches everyone better. In the cases of the first 3 women, however, there was little need to convict them on spectral evidence. Sarah Good, a vicious old woman, according to her husband's testimony, was known to mutter under her breath when passing people who had annoyed her. Surely she must be reciting curses? Sarah Osborne admitted that she had dreamed of a thing like an Indian, all black, which did prick her in the neck. Surely this was the devil marking her for his own? But the evidence of the slave Tituba was most sensational of all, and opened a new dimension of unease. It seemed that an organized coven was operating in the neighborhood. She had, she said, met the devil in the shape of a tall black man with white hair. Sometimes he had come in the shape of an animal. He had brought a book and made her place her mark in it, red like blood, thus binding her to him for 6 years. There had been 9 marks altogether in the book, 2 of them made by Good and Osborne, 2 made by witches from Boston. Both Good and Osborne, she said, had familiars, cats, birds, and a thing with wings and 2 legs and a head like a woman. Most disturbing of all, Osborne had a thing all over hairy, all the face hairy, and a long nose, and I don't know how how the face looks. It had 2 legs and goeth upright like a man. And last night it stood in Mr. Paris's hall. The 3 women were committed to jail. Osborne died there on 10th of May, and the slave Tituba was left there until she was sold to pay her jailer's fees. The Reverend Paris, being too shocked, no doubt, by the revelations of what had gone on in his house, to pay them. Sarah Good lay awaiting sentence. Meanwhile, Friday, 11th of March, was appointed as a day of fasting and prayer during which the ministers of Essex County would meet for a consultation. But instead of agreement, another seed of dissension was sown when the girls did just what Cotton Mather feared. They accused a respectable church member, Martha Corey, of witchcraft. Goodwife Corey had been skeptical from the first of the witchcraft charges, even refusing to allow her husband to visit the magistrate's examinations. When she expressed her skepticism in court, "We must not believe all that these distracted children say," she annoyed Judge Hawthorne. But much more damning, when she bit her lip in concentration, the children complained of being bitten in the same place, the marks showing clearly. Again, the clergy, in the person of Reverend Dodat Lawson, cautioned the magistrates against precipitate action. In church, Lawson preached that rash censoring of others without sufficient grounds is indeed to be like the devil, who is a false accuser. But the damage had been done. On the very day of Lawson's sermon, one of the most benevolent members of the community, a regular churchgoer named Rebecca Nurse, was accused. Even Judge Hawthorne was uncertain that this turn of events, as his questioning shows, he expressed his doubts and prayed that God might clear you if you be innocent. Nevertheless, precedents had been established, and the community was beginning to think the testimony of the children infallible. One sane, if rather brutal voice spoke out. A farmer named John Proctor, who employed one of the afflicted girls, Mary Warren, as a servant, rode into the village to fetch home his jade, as he put it. Dragging her off, he said, "If they were let alone, we should all be devils and witches quickly. They should be had to the whipping post." It was his intention, he said, to keep her close to the wheel and thrash her. Curiously, just as a slap in the face stops hysterical laughter, Proctor's whipping may have done Mary Warren some good, for she was the only one of the girls who completely recovered her sanity. Next, Dorcas Good, Sarah Good's 4-year-old daughter, volunteered that she herself had a little snake as a familiar, which sucked at a spot on her hand. The examiners noticed such a spot, about the bigness of a flea bite. Incredibly, they accepted the confession of the toddler without question. The Reverend Paris further confused matters by preaching a sermon to the effect that, as Judas had betrayed Christ, so the devout church member Rebecca Nurse might as well be the servant of Satan in disguise. When Rebecca's sister, Sarah Cloyes, heard this, she got up and left the church, slamming the door behind her. It was enough. Next day, the girls had pointed the finger at her, and she too was accused on 4 April, along with Elizabeth Proctor, wife of the farmer who had saved Mary Warren. Law, order, and lunacy. At this point, 4 other magistrates were appointed to sit with Corwin and Hawthorne, including Thomas Danforth, deputy governor of the colony. But it was Hawthorne, that bit firmly between his teeth, who continued to be the driving force. John Proctor joined his wife in the dock, closely followed by his servant Mary Warren, cured by the whipping she had received. She, in turn, was accused by her former fellow sufferers. On 19 April, Gilles Corey, husband of Martha Corey, was dragged before the court, along with 2 new suspects, a young girl named Abigail Hobbs and a woman named Bridget Bishop, who had a long-standing reputation as a witch. Abigail Hobbs was a prankster who loved shocking her elders. Once she had mocked the sacrament of baptism by pouring water over her mother's head, and on another occasion told a friend that she had sold herself body and soul to the old boy, presumably the devil. Bridget Bishop had been accused of witchcraft 10 years previously, but had been released when the Reverend Hale defended her. Nevertheless, it is likely that she was one of the 3 or 4 real witches turned up by the Salem inquiry. Witch dolls stuck with pins were found in her house. Certainly, many people willingly testified to her malice and her open avowal of supernatural powers. Another real witch was Candy, a Negro slave from Barbados, who gave a demonstration of her powers in court by tying a knot in rags, as these were first burned and there placed under water, so the afflicted girls suffered spectacularly. One was presently burned on the hand, while 2 were choked and strived for breath as if underwater. Cotton Mather was later to point out that by allowing these experiments to take place, the magistrates themselves were actively condoning witchcraft. But by this time, and means of combating the evil seemed permissible, so deem it did run. For it was one thing to accuse the likes of Bridget Bishop, Candy, Dorcas, or Dorcas, Whore, Hoar, by the way it's spelled, the Beverly Wise Woman, and Mammy Red, Town Witch of Marblehead. But quite another to find former minister of Salem Village in the dock. Salem's grim legacy. By the time the witch hunt of Salem had run its course, whole families had been ruined, and the very name of the village had become synonymous with the mindless persecution. But were all of the accused totally innocent? We may never know. On April 20th, 1692, 12-year-old Ann Putnam saw the apparition of a Puritan minister who half strangled her. Anne, one of the bewitched girls of Salem Village, Massachusetts, asked her ghostly tormentor who he was. Obligingly, he told her he was the Reverend George Burroughs, who had been minister at the village between 1680 and 1682, when Anne was 2 years old. She was grievously affrighted, according to evidence presented to the witchcraft court, and cried out, "Oh, dreadful, dreadful! Here is a minister come. What are ministers witches too?" In this case, the court decided George Burroughs was indeed a witch. He was recalled from the village in Maine, where he held his present living, and brought back to Salem to answer the charges against him to Judge John Hawthorne. Burroughs's position in the community made him an obvious leader of the oddly assorted collection of witches already arrested. Burroughs, a short, stocky man, had been suspected by popular gossip of doing away with both his wives while minister at Salem. Now Ann Putnam confirmed the rumors. She had seen the wraiths of the two women, she said, and they told her that they had been victims of their husband's witchcraft. Devilish eavesdropping? Goodman Ruck, Burroughs's former brother-in-law, told the court that on one occasion, when he and his sister and Burroughs had been out picking strawberries, the minister had left them for a while and had rejoined them further along the road. When he was able to repeat the conversation they had in his absence. When they expressed surprise, Burroughs had told them, "My God makes known your thoughts unto me," by which Ruck explained he meant the devil. Unfortunately for Burroughs, he was apparently in the habit of hiding, listening to conversations, and then reporting them verbatim to his astonished listeners. Not a trick liable to endear him to the hysterical inhabitants of Salem. Despite his small stature and his broad shoulders, gave Burroughs enormous strength, which he had used to impress the community. There is evidence to suggest that he used tricks to enhance his strong-arm reputation, appearing to lift a 7-foot musket simply by inserting his forefinger in the barrel. For instance, the picking up a barrel of molasses between finger and thumb. The magistrates, however, took these tales of evidence of real supernatural power. And when it was revealed that Burroughs thought he made his wives sign oaths of secrecy about his exploits, he was finished. For although some of those who had confessed so far, Tituba, for instance, and Dorcas Good, were spared, for others, the inquiry had become a hanging matter. On 27th of May, Governor William Phipps, who, assisted by the Reverend Increase Mather, had been negotiating a new charter for Massachusetts, turned away from more pressing business to establish a court of oyer and terminer. These courts, abolished in 1972, were set up especially by royal commission to inquire into serious criminal matters. Phipps appointed the cream of New England judges who, acting on the written advice of Cotton Mather, tended towards leniency at first. Mather stressed that it is better that 10 witches go free than one innocent person be convicted. But on 10th of June, the court claimed its first victim, Bridget Bishop. On 19th July, the malicious Sarah Good, the innocent Rebecca Nurse, and 3 other women followed her to the gallows. As she climbed the gallows steps, Sarah Good made a prediction that some were to think, in retrospect, proved her guilt. When the Reverend Nicholas Noyes asked her to repent of her witchcraft, she cried out, "You are a liar. I am no more a witch than you are a wizard, and if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink." A quarter of a century later, Noyes suffered a massive lung hemorrhage and choked on his own blood. Judge Hawthorne's great-great-grandson, Nathaniel Hawthorne, used the incident in his novel The House of the Seven Gables. Huh. Wow. That's interesting. Okay. On 19 August, five more people, including the Reverend George Burroughs and the whip-wielding farmer John Proctor, were hanged on Gallows Hill. Burroughs made a good impression on the crowd by reciting the Lord's Prayer perfectly, something no witch was supposed to be able to do. But Cotton Mather addressed the spectators from horseback, maintaining that the devil could appear as an angel of light. This, above more than his repeated appeals for leniency and common sense, blackened Mathers's name for posterity. But he had recommended that Proctor's wife Elizabeth be spared. She had been condemned to death with him, but was allowed to plead her belly. She was pregnant and was later released. In September came one of the bravest stands against the increasing madness of the court. Giles Corey, husband of Martha Corey, refused to recognize the impartiality of his judges and thus subjected to peine forte et dure, pressing with heavy weights to make him answer the charges. He died after 2 days of this torture on 19 September, still silent, his tongue being pressed out of his mouth, recorded one contemporary. The sheriff, with his cane, forced it in again when he was dying. Wow. A rather less dramatic stand had been taken by Captain John Alden of Boston, who had been accused by the demented girls while on a visit to Salem. He stood in court, a bold fellow, with his hat on before the judges. And it was said that he sells powder and shot to the Indians and the French, and lies with the Indian squaws, and has Indian papooses. When one of the magistrates, Bartholomew Gedney, remarked how the witnesses fell down when Alden looked on them, Alden asked what reason there could have given why Alden's looking upon him did not strike him down as well, but no reason was given. Alden later escaped from jail and made his way to New York, returning when the witch hunt was over. But 8 more people, including Martha Corey and the wise woman Mammy Red, were executed on 22 September. By now, an air of black farce was creeping in. One man, for instance, was accused of firing a mare's fart by sticking a lighted tobacco pipe up its anus in order to relieve the bellyache. That is crazy. I'm going to read that again. By now, an air of black farce was creeping in. One man, for instance, was accused of firing a mare's fart by sticking a lighted tobacco pipe up its anus in order to relieve the bellyache. When the girls were taken to Andover, a small town quieter, if anything, than even Salem Village had been previously, they claimed that there was 40 men in it that could raise the devil as well as any astrologer. In fact, over 50 people were complained of in Andover, and when the local magistrate Dudley Bradstreet had signed 30 or 40 warrants, he came to his senses and refused to grant more. Predictably, he and his wife were immediately accused and fled to New Hampshire. Bradstreet's brother, John, was also forced to flee. His dog was therefore executed instead. Cotton Mather's prediction that worthy people would be caught up in the general panic was gradually coming true. One Boston merchant threatened to sue his accusers to the tune of £1,000, upon which the charges were promptly dropped. Other people accused but not proceeded against included Judge Nathaniel Saltonstall, who had resigned from the court in protest at its inhumanity, Philip English, a relative of Judge Hawthorne, and the mother-in-law of Judge Corwin, a lady named Mrs. Margaret Thatcher. The end of the madness. Increase and Cotton Mather renewed their protest at the admission of a spectral evidence, and by late summer, accepting Mr. Hales, Mr. Noyes, and Mr. Paris, the Reverend elders throughout the county were very much dissatisfied. On 29 October, the clergy led by Increase Mather presented a bill before the General Court of Massachusetts in Boston calling for the dismissal of the court of Oyer and Terminer. The bill also called for a fast day, that they might be led in the right way towards the witchcrafts. The witch hunt was over. Then began the recriminations and the allocation of blame. After a long argument in council, the Reverend Paris was dismissed from the Salem village, living in 1697, on the grounds that he had been the beginner and procurer of the trouble by publicizing the girl's possession in the first place. The excommunications of several church members, including Martha Corey and Rebecca Nurse, were posthumously lifted, while survivors such as Elizabeth Proctor, who, because of their sentences, had been unable to possess the property of their executed relatives, were compensated by the court. But the heartbreak suffered by many in the community was not to be lifted so easily. One petition sent to the General Court, set up in 1710 to investigate, speaks for many. My wife was in prison about 4 months and then executed. A sucking child died in prison before the mother's execution. A child of 4 or 5 was in prison 7 or 8 months, and being chained in the dungeon, was so heartily used and terrified that she hath ever since been very chargeable, having little or no reason to govern herself. And I leave it unto the honorable court to judge what damage I have sustained by such a destruction of my poor family. a crying shame. 7 women, including Bridget Bishop and Mammy Red, never did receive a reversal of their attainders, a pardon. The nearest their descendants got was in a resolution by the General Court of Massachusetts in 1957 to the effect that whereas certain descendants are still distressed by the record of said proceedings, the witchcraft trials, the General Court of Massachusetts declares its belief that such proceedings were and are shocking, and as all the laws under which said proceedings, even if then legally conducted, have been long since abandoned and superseded by our more civilized laws. No disgrace or cause for distress attached to the said descendants. There were undoubtedly strange things going on at Salem. The seance that first set the girls off into pathological hysteria has exact parallels in well-attested modern cases. The evidence of Tituba, the Caribbean Indian slave, when taken as a whole, seems to indicate that she had at least some of the characteristics of an excellent medium. The Reverend George Burroughs, trickery apart, did have a deep knowledge of diabolism and behaved very oddly for a Puritan minister who admitted that he had not taken communion for years, and only the eldest of his children had been baptized. And there can be a little doubt about the efficacy of at least some of the spells cast by the many village wise women who had been called before the Salem courts. Anthropologists have shown repeatedly that witchcraft works in societies that believe in it. But the blind and mindless horror brought down by otherwise benevolent men on their own people, swiftly followed by apparently sincere shame and repentance for what they had done, is of a deeper order entirely. When the anti-communist witch hunts of the McCarthyite 1950s were seen in retrospect to compare so closely with the events in Salem Village, it seemed that man's own devilish power to wreak havoc among the virtuous had not diminished with the passing of time. Okay, we have arrived at the last portion here. The Flower and the Skull. Did the 3 women of the Flower family kill the Earl of Rutland's son through witchcraft in the early 17th century? Or were they themselves victims of an hysterical witch hunt? In the Church of St. Mary the Virgin at Bottlesford in Leicestershire, there is a tomb that is unique in English art. It is called the Witchcraft Tomb and is the only English memorial whose inscription claims that the deceased died through witchcraft. The tomb is that of the 6th Earl of Rutland, who died in 1632. The marble monument consists of 3 life-sized recumbent images raised on tiers. The topmost effigy is that of Lady Frances, who became the wife of the 6th Earl in 1604, and who bore him a daughter. The center effigy is that of the Earl himself, wearing the court dress appropriate to his rank and the Order of the Garter. At his feet is the family crest of a peacock with spread tail. The effigy on the lowest of these three shelves is that of his second wife, Cecilia Hungerford, whom he married shortly after the death of his first wife in 1608. At the head of the group, kneeling in prayer, is the effigy of his daughter Catherine, who eventually became the Duchess of Buckingham. At their feet and their at their feet are two effigies of the sons born to him of the Countess Cecilia. Above the group, there is a long and somewhat pompous inscription, almost certainly written by the Earl himself, who designed the tomb. This mainly records his travels and honors accorded him on the continent. But it is this his inscription that makes the tomb unique, for it records, in 1608, he married the Lady Cecilia Hungerford, daughter to the Honorable Knight Sir John Tufton, by whom he had two sons, both which died in their infancy by wicked practice and sorcery. The effigies of the two sons hold skulls. The elder, Henry, holds a skull in his left hand, while the younger, Francis, holds a skull in his right. But the symbolical flower that Francis holds in his left hand is the direct reference to the supposed manner of his death. For the surname of the witches who were supposed to have caused it was Flower. The Flower family, a mother and two daughters, worked in the home of the 6th Earl Belvoir Castle. Joan Flower was a kind of general chairwoman, but the daughters, Philippa and Margaret, lived in the castle, the latter looking after the poultry and attending to the laundry. Both servants gained bad reputations, and Margaret was dismissed, although it seems in a kindly manner. Shortly afterwards, the elder son of the Earl, Henry, Lord Roos, fell sick and after a lingering illness died, to be buried in Bodisford Church in September 1613. Local suspicion insisted that he had died from witchcraft. The three Flower women, who had, as most people imagined, some reason for damaging the Earl and his wife, and who had already a reputation for being witches, were arrested in 1617, long after the death of the child, and were brought before local magistrates, who included Samuel Fleming, rector of Botsford. These gentlemen passed the women on to the further examination before justices at Lincoln Jail. Joan Fowler never reached Lincoln, for she died in mysterious circumstances on her way to trial. Accounts vary, but some insist that she asked for bread, ate it, and choked. This account corresponds in essence to popular traditions. It was widely believed that witches could not eat bread. The superstition was linked with the idea of the sacramental quality of bread. A witch possessed by demons or by the devil himself could not take Christ in sacramental form into his or her being. Another account tells the story as though Joan herself were attempting to prove her innocence and called down upon her the wrath of God. But Joan Fowler, before her conviction, as they say, called for bread and butter, and wished it might never go through her if she were guilty of that whereupon she was examined. So mumbling it in her mouth, never spake more words after, but fell down and died, with a horrible excruciation of soul and body. Margaret confessed on 22 January 1618 during an examination before Sir Henry Hobart, the Chief Justice of the Common Pleas, and local dignitary Sir Edward Bromley. She and her sister claimed that they had cast the death spell and had bewitched the elder child, his brother, and his sister. Further, they had cast spells on the Countess might bear no more children. All this they had done because they were angry at being dismissed from service at the castle. The story they told was full of the traditional imagery of witchcraft. Margaret described how they had cast the death spell by using a glove stolen from young Henry. Her mother had stroked her familiar, a cat, with the glove, dipped it in hot water, and pierced it with scissors. Thus, they insisted, had brought the child to his death. 2 years later, another glove had been misused in this way, and Frances was similarly bewitched. They had confessed, and both Margaret and Philippa Fowler were found guilty. They were hanged at Lincoln on 12 March 1618. A survivor of the curse? If the records are to be believed, the second child did not die until all three witches were themselves dead. He survived until 7 March 1619 and was buried in St. Nicholas Chapel, Westminster, at the time when the 6th Earl was attending the king. But popular accounts insist that the two children died at more or less the same time. One of the guidebooks to Botsford Church even repeats this version of the story, perhaps because of the ambiguity of the inscription on the witchcraft tomb. We may be sure that when the 6th Earl was writing his own epitaph, he himself believed that his children had been hexed or cursed to death. The villagers who had the three women arrested, the examining magistrates, and presumably also the judges at Lincoln, sincerely believed that the women were witches. Such was the superstition of the time. One may today wonder not so much whether they were witches as whether they actually believed themselves to be witches. The strength of the legal argument, such as it was, rested upon their own admission of guilt. The women confessed, as the inscription on the tomb records. This might lead one to suppose that they confessed freely, for it is generally believed that under English law, torture was not permitted. Torture was, indeed, forbidden by English common law, but there are all too many cases recorded where this law was deliberately ignored. Direct torture was often applied. It may have been unofficial, but it was certainly effective. While the majority of those accused of witchcraft denied their confessions, apparently made under duress, and pleaded not guilty, they had neither counsel to defend them nor any legal advice. And since there was no legal requirement for evidence, almost anything could be admitted in court. For example, since it is widely believed that witches had familiar spirits that masqueraded as pets, Any old woman who kept a cat or a dog and who was disliked in the neighborhood was in danger of being arrested as a witch. Margaret Fowler, when examined in January 1618, confessed to the heinous crime of owning a cat called Rudderkin, who would whine and cry mew. The Botsford witches became more than merely a forgotten footnote in history. One authority tells us that King James I, who was a friend of the sixth Earl, was loath to believe that there were witches, but that which happened to my Lord Francis of Rutland's children convinced him. There is sheer nonsense for when the Scot This is sheer nonsense, for when the Scottish James VI began his reign in England as James I in 1603, he was already a firm believer in witchcraft, and indeed brought out a new edition of his influential demonology in London during his year of accession. The Fowler case seems to be exceptionally curious, for the two daughters were hanged for murder. Yet it was their mother who was supposed to have actually enacted the spell. Again, one of the children, whom they are reputed to have killed by witchcraft, died only after they had paid the supreme penalty. As the historian of Belvoir Castle points out, the principal charge against them was their having a cat called Rudderkin, the supposed diabolical agent of their machinations. In the light of modern understanding, it is apparent that the three women were not witches. They died, like many other innocents of the time, as sacrifice to superstition. And the perpetuation of their name was due partly to the publication of a pamphlet in the year of their death, a fairly standard practice for notorious executions. The document that is a sop to the anti-witchcraft fervor of King James's reign. But despite the direct reference to sorcery on the tomb, there is an ironical footnote. The flower clutched in the hand of the younger son has a double symbolism. Although an obvious pointer to the alleged witches of the Flower family, it is also a symbol of innocence. And that's the end, folks. That's our index. Okay. So that's all I'm going to do for today. All right. We've taken a lot of your time. Hopefully you enjoyed this stroll down this very interesting book. So I believe I'm going to stop here. But if any of you want more, make comments in make a comment, send me an email. You can send me an email at 93 wake the dead at gmail.com. I'm just realizing I was just reading about Crowley, and then this 93. I had to have a number, guys. I'm not a Thelemite. It wouldn't give me wake the dead. But anyway, so going back to this, if any of you, that's all I'm planning to read. But if any of you listening want me to continue and want to hear more of this stuff, there is, there's some, you can see here if you're watching, the contents, a guide to dowsing. It's where it starts. Symbols in the sky. That's all zodiac. Knowledge by numbers. It's obviously numerology, gematria, glimpse of the future, I Ching and fortune telling, occult design, celestial harmonies, the fractals and all that. Besides that, I've read the rest. I guess I didn't read The Alchemist's Art. I could read that too. There's The Hidden Face of Falconelli and Transformation of the Alchemist in there. I mean, this is a fun book. And if you want me to read that too, just make some comments. Tell me what you think is a good idea. I'm not opposed to suggestions. And I guess that's about it. If you're still listening, thank you so much for being here and for, maintaining interest in this, what I'm reading here. So if any of you find value in this that I have brought to you today, please consider a donation. I do not have commercials. I do not operate in that way. I have a regular job and I work a truck and I lift heavy boxes. Anyway, I have a family and we need to survive. So if you so choose, please go to onegreatworknetwork.com/Sean-McCann. There you will find a donate button where there are buy me a coffee and PayPal, Bitcoin. You can send, if you can send me anything. I have a P.O. box. Send me some mail, send me a letter, send me some cool stuff. Send me some cannabis if you so want to be so generous. Send me a donation, please. You can address it to Wake the Dead or Sean McCann, P.O. Box 93, Oberlin, Ohio, 44074. And I thank you all for listening. And please check out Wake the Dead, which is my other podcast. I've just recently had Jerry Marzinski, and we soon will be again having Carrie Olahe. And there are many familiar voices. I will be continuing the long deep dives with William Ramsey and Hans Utter. I will be releasing another interview with Hans Utter, a deep dive on the radio and mind control. That will be coming soon as well. Thank you much for listening, and I appreciate your attention and your ears. Thank you again, and I'm so delighted that you have all chosen to click on this new endeavor that I have started here, Occult Kubrick. And we will see you next time. Thank you again. Cheers.